Coverage tomorrow here on C-SPAN. Now a hearing on the investigation of the crash of TWA Flight 800. Today, a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee examined allegations that FBI actions taken during the investigation may have endangered public safety. Testifying before the subcommittee, investigators of the TWA crash from the FBI and the National Transportation Safety Board. Iowa Senator Charles Grassley chairs the 3.5-hour hearing.
Call the hearing to order. I'm Senator Chuck Grassley, chairman of this subcommittee, and I'm welcome everybody to the hearing, and particularly welcome our witnesses, many who had to go out of way to be here. We appreciate it very much. Today's hearing is the result of a 2-year review by the subcommittee into how federal agencies handled the investigation of what caused the crash of the TWA Flight 800. The subcommittee conducted dozens of interviews of professionals from various agencies who were either on the crash scene or were at high levels within the various headquarters of the various agencies. A consensus emerged from these interviews, supported by documentary evidence, about the conduct of the investigation. The collective testimony from today's witnesses will leave a very clear picture of that conduct, and of course it is a troubling picture. This investigation was run by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. There is much doubt about whether the FBI had statutory authority as the lead agency. More on that point later. What the public knows about the crash and its cause is what they know through countless press conferences and leaks to the press. The public also has heard numerous conspiracy theories and mis- or disinformation. The purpose of this hearing is to provide a much more real picture of what happened and hopefully why it happened. The motivation for the subcommittee's efforts is to continue to help restore public confidence in federal law enforcement. It is my intention to examine some very basic and systemic problems uncovered in this investigation. The goal is to have a constructive dialogue with the FBI to ensure similar problems are not repeated in the future. No one will be fingered as a scapegoat. However, if the FBI says today that its problems are of the past and it's now fixed, I won't buy that. And I warn the public not to buy it either. There's a whole lot more to be done before the root causes of the problem is fixed. It's a systemic cultural problem that transcends any simplistic fix. I'd like to give a word about today's witnesses, because it's not easy for them to be critical of questionable actions that they saw by FBI personnel. These witnesses will likely have to work with the FBI again. And the FBI is bigger and more powerful than their agencies, though there is an intimidation factor here. But that's not why these witnesses are coming forward. They're coming forward because of what they saw, and what they saw offended them, both from the law enforcement standpoint and from the standpoint of public safety. They're coming forward because they truly believe it will serve the public interest and will improve the way that we investigate future incidents. This is an honorable thing for these people to do. The subcommittee appreciates their testimony, and I'm confident that the public will as well. Now, this is a story about how the world's preeminent law enforcement agency, at least in terms of image and expectations, sometimes acted like it didn't even have a clue. I believe that each and every FBI agent and employee who showed up on the scene of that tragic crash did the best job they could and had the best motives. The same goes for the employees of the other agencies and groups that work so hard. Many volunteered to do that, and they sacrificed their time and their commitment to a greater and humanitarian good. There was a basic problem, however. In my view, it was one of leadership. FBI leadership in the case of the TWA Flight 800 was a disaster. The FBI says that its investigation in this case is a model for the future. The FBI believes that even now. I say that because of their testimony they submitted for this hearing. If the FBI still believes that after this hearing, then I think the American people should be very alarmed about whether or not the FBI gets a message. Because this investigation, which by statute was supposed to be run by the NTSB, but which was commandeered by the FBI, is a model of failure, not success. And anyone who doubts that is not confronting reality. The testimony that we will hear today will describe three things. First, it will show how the FBI lacked the proper training to handle the investigation of this type and violated the most basic standards of forensic science in terms of collecting evidence, handling that evidence, and preserving the evidence. It's the kind of thing that would make even rookie cops wince. Second, we will try to understand the culture within the FBI that allows this sort of thing to happen. Why does the world's preeminent law enforcement agency make the kinds of mistakes that even rookies don't make? And third, why is it that the FBI would try to prevent critical public safety information from getting to the proper authorities? A January '97 ATF report, which will be discussed today, showed that the cause of the crash of the TWA 800 was a mechanical failure. The FBI did not want that report out. It tried to suppress it. And the FBI feared that if the case became a criminal case and went to court, the ATF report would be discoverable through a Brady doctrine and might help exculpate the potential suspects. But the FBI had the cart before the horse. You can't start suppressing information when there's no crime. The vast majority of explosions like TWA are due to accidents, not to sabotage. For the FBI to assume first that an explosion is sabotage reveals its lack of experience in dealing with explosion incidents. Indeed, the FBI rarely investigates explosions and fires. Other law enforcement agencies, most notably the ATF, investigates many explosions and has lots of experience. The proof is in the pudding. The ATF called the cause of the crash correctly 10 months before the FBI did. In fact, it's fair to say that the FBI hindered the investigation and the public's and the family's right to know. And in the process, in my view, the FBI risked public safety. Before we begin, I'd like to clarify one critical issue. The FBI's suppression of the ATF report is a serious matter. In testimony from the third panel today, we will hear how the top FBI manager on this case, Mr. Jim Kallstrom, didn't want crucial public safety information to go to public safety officials, and that's the National Transportation Safety Board. He succeeded in bottling it up. The NTSB has told us, and told us all along, that they never received a copy of the report. Last Friday, pursuant to a document request to the FBI by the subcommittee, we discovered a draft letter dated March 17, 97, from Mr. Kallstrom to the chairman of the NTSB, Mr. Jim Hall. The unsigned draft letter said that a copy of the AIT report was enclosed. The FBI is claiming that this draft letter lets them off the hook, saying that they did indeed send the ATF report to the NTSB. The fact is, it doesn't let them off the hook. I've been through too many Ruby Ridges and Wacos and Richard Jewell's investigations to buy into that argument. I suspect that maybe the American public will be equally skeptical. When the draft transmittal letter came to the subcommittee's attention, I asked the NTSB to verify if such a letter had indeed been received by them. The computerized mail system that logs in all letters to the chairman showed that no such letter came in. An interview of the appropriate handlers of such letters showed no recollection of that letter. Moreover, the FBI says that pursuant to the subcommittee's document request, all relevant documents have been produced. Since no signed, finalized letter appears in the document production, I think it's wise to be skeptical that the ATF report was ever sent to the NTSB. And in fact, that is what the NTSB has stated. And in my view, that means the FBI is still not off the hook in terms of risking public safety in this case. Once again, the purpose of this hearing is to continue the subcommittee's efforts to help restore public confidence in federal law enforcement. As the nation's preeminent federal law enforcement agency, the FBI, under the scrutiny of the public's eye, has an obligation to ensure that the egregious problems that we will hear about today never happen again. And I will do all that I can to help us through that process. We'll go now to our first panel. I call Mr. Hank Hughes, Senior Accident Investigator, the NTSB, also in charge of one of the hangars, Mr. Michael Marks, former Chief Metallurgist of the NTSB, and Mr. Frank Zakar, current NTSB Metallurgist. We've asked these witnesses, just please be seated. I'm sorry, you folks were standing because I was going to swear you in. Do you, I would ask you to raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the whole truth? The truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
We've asked witnesses, except for the last panel, not to prepare remarks, so we'll be getting the information from all of you through question and answer. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Marks. Were you aware that the FBI had violated security and brought in a psychic?
I was not directly aware of it, but I was aware that they did. I didn't see the psychic come into the hangar.
How were you aware of that?
I saw some documentation that indicated that there was a report of the psychic.
Okay. What was the reaction by you and others when you learned about this happening?
It's a reaction that it certainly was uncalled for, especially at that particular point of the investigation.
Why would it be unusual for a psychic to be brought in on the scene at this time?
Well, I don't know what we at the safety board itself, we would never bring in a psychic to do any investigation because it is the scientific examination of wreckage and the overall investigation that determines the causes or leads towards the causes. So we would not bring any, it'd be against the grain to bring a psychic in to find out what happened on the aircraft.
In your view, did FBI personnel unreasonably push the bomb and missile theories to your knowledge?
Yes.
I would like to, would you explain in some your rationale?
Well, the rationale behind that statement would be the fact that there's a period of time when it could be it would be a possibility that some sabotage, such as a missile or a bomb, could be on board the airplane. And this was during an initial portion of the investigation where we had an airplane that came out of the sky for no apparent reason. However, and there was also the fact that most of the wreckage was sitting 100 feet down on the sea floor. So most of the wreckage was not available except for flotsam that came up. So it was after the initial investigation when they started to get the majority of the wreckage into the hangar, and you're able to look at the wreckage and determine how the airplane broke up, as well as get the information from where they found the actual wreckage. At this particular point, and looking at all of the physical evidence and not seeing any evidence of any bomb or missile damage, it became unreasonable to continue to push that theory.
Give us the approximate time frame for what you have just told me.
This would be in the neighborhood of September, late September, October, and November 1996. This would be the year of the accident.
Okay. Could you please describe for me the difficulties that you encountered from the FBI with your photography?
The FBI set up the security at the Calverton hangar. As an organization, it had a clearly marked that no cameras were allowed inside the Calverton hangar. And the only way that the procedures that could be produced to get photography was through the FBI directly. In other words, the FBI photographer had to take the photographs. Any photographs that were taken at that particular time had to be developed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And all photographs, as I understand it, that were returned back had to stay in the hangar, could not go outside the hangar.
Okay. You're describing a situation where you, in your work, you normally take lots of pictures.
That's correct.
And use them as part of your scientific investigation, right?
That's correct.
And they were going to allow you to take pictures, but they had to develop them, or they didn't even allow you to take pictures.
In the case, initially, there was, the procedures sort of changed from one point to another, but basically, the photographs were basically had to be taken initially by the FBI, as I understood it. And then, if you did take photographs, you had to then have a certain procedure, but all the film had to be developed by the FBI.
What sort of a reason did they give you that you couldn't develop your own pictures?
They didn't give me any reason.
They didn't give you any reason. That's just the way it's going to be. How did this impede your work?
Well, in the case of on the second time that I was there, this was in October, when I was taking photographs, having the FBI photographer take photographs. He had a film, of course, which he then took and went back to the New York field office to get developed. And I was there for a period of time of 3 or 4 days at that particular time, and then A month later, when I came back to get the photographs, they also said that it would take a week to 2 weeks to get these photographs. These photographs never showed up. To this day, do not have those particular photographs. So how does it impede the investigation is that there was no apparent record of the photographs that was taken, and it was not disseminated properly so that we could get these particular photographs later on. So it was then after that I challenged the FBI in the photographic arena. Since I could not get photographs, I then, even though the science said not to take a camera in there and do photographic by yourself, I ended up doing it since I was the chief of the materials lab for the NTSB at that particular time, and that's part of our duties. We were looking at the structural breakup of this particular airplane, and I ended up challenging that procedure, that the FBI was to do all their own photography, and in other words, do all the processing of the film. And eventually I got that to come through, but there was a threat that I was not supposed to be doing this, and eventually it came back from a higher up in the FBI that I would be allowed to do it.
The FBI brought in a company called Brookhaven Laboratories. What do you know about the company, and why were they brought in?
Well, Brookhaven National Laboratories is a government facility that's close by to the Calverton hangar. The people that were ahead of the investigation for the FBI were pushing to get an outside expertise, so to speak, to look at some of the wreckage. And they were mainly looking at areas that had to do with penetration, small penetrations that were in the fuselage. And they wanted to get somebody that apparently they thought was independent, or somebody to check what we would be doing or do something that's separate than what we would be doing during the accident investigation. They were looking for evidence of some type of sabotage or some type of penetration that was in the fuselage.
Probably should have done this before I ask you your first question, but I think I'm going to ask you and each of you before you ask questions. I'll give you the opportunity now. You should supply for the committee orally now your background, expertise, and what your role was in the TWA investigation.
Well, I have a Bachelor of Science and Master's of Science from Michigan Technological University, which I obtained in 1966 and 1967. I then worked for 2 years at the Boeing Aircraft Company in Seattle, Washington. And then following that, I worked 1 year at the Bell Helicopter Company in Fort Worth, Texas, all in failure analysis of aircraft components. Since November 1970, I worked continuously for the National Transportation Safety Board, starting off as a metallurgist, going to senior metallurgist, going to the chief of the Materials Laboratory Division, and eventually the chief technical advisor for metallurgy for the Safety Board. During the time of the investigation of TWA, I was the chief of the Materials Laboratory Division. And at that time, one of the other gentlemen here that's going to testify, Mr. Frank Zakar, I was his supervisor at that particular time. Frank had been on scene since very shortly after the accident until for about 3 months when the wreckage was starting to come in. And late September, I went into got involved in the investigation when we had a lot of the wreckage that was already recovered. I was the principal person that was involved in the looking over the reports that dealt with the investigation as far as metallurgical engineering is concerned, metallurgy in general. But I also was involved with the structures metallurgy sequencing group that was formed, and that was formed and put into effect in around the 1st of December of 1996 for most of the time during December. And it was a pivotal point to analyze the structure of the airplane from a sequencing standpoint. And the reason being is that even though there was evidence that there was a explosion that was in the fuel tank, there was still a need to find out whether anything else could have caused that explosion in that fuel tank other than some source that was on the airplane or some secondary type of damage that could have caused the explosion in the fuel tank. It was not the idea to have this sequencing group determine the exact reason why, what the specific reason for the explosion, but only to indicate through its analysis whether it could be the initiating event that caused the structural damage. So I was eminently involved in that, set up the sequencing group, and that's how I got involved. After that, I was more or less involved in various other aspects of the investigation, including some of the stuff that dealt with the holes and with the FBI wanting to solicit other expertise.
I would assume that it's got to be incredible to you that a person with your background in this area and working for as long as you have with a key agency that's involved in transportation safety, that you would have these problems with the FBI doing your job, and the very same agency that bring in a psychic to see why a plane went down. Doesn't that seem kind of odd to you? I mean...
Well, yes, it's, as I understand it, the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, is the lead agency for aircraft accident investigations. And until there is a criminal act that was declared, I mean, it was my understanding that we should be doing the investigation of that aircraft accident.
Yeah. What did Brookhaven do that the federal government couldn't do, and did Brookhaven add anything to the investigation?
Brookhaven did not have the, they have a very intelligent people that work at Brookhaven. It's a very good organization, but they haven't neither the expertise or the experience to do any aircraft accident investigation. They've never looked at any wreckage. They had basically a very poor background to do any forensic type investigation or any kind of an accident investigation in this particular case, because the safety board had all the expertise that is needed to do that, and was advising the FBI that this was not, we were just kind of like standby looking at what they were trying to produce, but we more or less discouraged this type of operation.
Mr. Hughes, before I ask you your first question, would you give us your background, your expertise, and what was your role in this investigation?
Yes, sir. I started my career in investigative work in 1967. I was trained by the Army as a military intelligence specialist. In 1972, I joined the Fairfax County Police Department in Virginia. Subsequent to my completion of training and a few years on the job, I served as a staff member and instructor at the Northern Virginia Criminal Justice Academy for 8 years on the instructional staff at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I've also served for 4 years at the University of Southern California teaching accident investigation. I came to the Safety Board in 1985 and joined as a member of the Highway Division. Approximately 3 years later, I transferred to the Bureau of Technology, where I cross-trained. I've been with the Safety Board, as I said, since 1985, and during the course of my tenure there, I've investigated 109 major transportation accidents in all 5 modes of transportation. On the TWA investigation, I was assigned initially with the GO team as the team's survival factors specialist. Upon arrival, it was quite clear that my expertise in that area was limited in terms of need. And at that time, I was directed by the investigator in charge to find a suitable place to try to reconstruct the airplane, and along with some of our folks from management, they found a suitable place, the Calverton facility, which was a former Grumman aircraft plant, and it was my responsibility to set up the reconstruction area, the layout of the aircraft, and then about 3 weeks into the investigation, I was transferred and led the team that reconstructed the interior of the aircraft.
Okay. I'm going to have my staff bring a sheet of paper to you, and the purpose of bringing this to you is to ask you to verify if those are notes that you provided my subcommittee investigators.
Yes, sir, it certainly is.
Okay. Let me ask, do those notes reflect the handwritten contemporaneous notes that you kept in the diary during the TWA investigation?
Yes, they do.
Would you tell the subcommittee why you felt compelled to take those notes?
From a professional standpoint, I was greatly distressed and disturbed with the professional working relationship we had with the FBI, as along with my observations of the working relationship with the FBI and the other organizations, to include the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and the Federal Aviation Administration, and TWA and the other parties. But it was a matter of professional concern.
Okay. Would you summarize in general the nature of the problems that you saw and why you believe they occurred? For example, from the standpoint of inadequate training, that and anything else that you can lend to our body of information we need.
Yes, sir. The FBI has a group called the Evidence Recovery Team, or I should say several groups. To my knowledge, there were about 30 to 32 that participated in the TWA investigation. It's also my understanding that 28 of the 32 had absolutely no or very little forensic science training whatsoever. I got to a point where after a few months I was asked by the FBI to teach a 4-hour class on basic forensic procedures and biohazard protection to the newly arriving emergency, I should say evidence recovery teams, to provide them with a basic knowledge of how to perform their duties at the accident reconstruction area.
Would you go down the list and briefly describe each of these points and indicate the proper way to do them, what the proper way would have been?
Yes, sir. I think early on, part of my job in survival factors is crash worthiness and basically investigating the deaths of the passengers and crew. Part of that job is to coordinate with the medical examiner's office. In this case, the Suffolk County Medical Examiner's Office. Dr. Charles Wetley is in charge. It was distressing to me when I first went to the ME's office to see that the FBI agents, although there were several, in fact, probably dozens at the ME's office, there was little or no consideration to establishing a chain of custody on the clothing of the victims, and for that matter, some of the particulate matter that had been extracted from the victims and the clothing. Clothing and particulate matter were commingled, and the documentation as to what came from where was spotty at best. Another concern that I had initially was that in terms of our investigative effort, it was very important to know where the victims had been recovered from. Yet little or no effort was made to do a GPS fix on the victims, and subsequently we know little in a lot of cases as to where people came from. That's the first item. There are about 16 of them. I mentioned that the clothing was stored, was collected and commingled. A standard procedure for any clothing in a crime scene or other accident site, and the procedures are basically the same. There's no difference between a crime scene and an accident scene investigation in terms of the handling of evidence. But wet clothing, whether it's wet by chemicals, body chemicals, blood, or water, salt water in this case, the proper procedure is to air dry the clothing, wrap it in clean butcher paper after it's been photographed, catalog it, and put it away for safekeeping. In the case of TWA, all of the clothing was taken to a refrigerator truck marked Anderson on the side, which had been towed to the accident site. Unfortunately, about 7 or 8 weeks into the investigation, the refrigerator truck refrigeration unit ran out of diesel fuel, and for approximately a day and a half, the clothing got warm and began to mold along with the other material stored in this trailer, and was destroyed as far as any evidentiary value. The seat covers on the seats were another issue. Again, if there had been an explosion, whether it's a mechanical or structural problem or an intentional event, any damage to any part of the airplane has to be scrutinized closely. Many of the seat covers, there were 430 passenger seats and 21 crew seats, had their seat covers removed, and they were commingled in a dumpster. About 2 months into the investigation, I went to the dumpster with the assistance, I have to say, of an FBI agent, and tried to sort out the materials in there. And we found, in addition to the seat covers, actually seats that had been missing that were mistakenly thrown in there. Chemical swabbing was another area.
Before you go on, whose decision was that on the point you just made?
That was a decision made by the FBI, sir.
Okay.
Another area of concern with regard to the reconstruction of the interior was the chemical swabbing of the seats. And as well, when you're especially looking for projectile shrapnel-like debris, would be to x-ray the seats. However, there was never any consistency in either the x-raying of the passenger seats or the chemical swabbing of the seats. Although as the seats were collected, my team and I went to great pains to specifically tag the seats to identify those that had not been examined. Yet to this day, those tags are still there because they haven't. The FBI never went back and did a subsequent exam, either by chemical swab or x-ray examination. Another problem that occurred, and it was recognized about 2 months into the investigation, was the disappearance of parts from the hangar. I complained about it at several of our nightly investigative progress meetings, yet it fell on deaf ears for a long time. Finally, the group that I worked with, there were 10 of us, I might add, including ATF and 3 New York State troopers, as well as TWA personnel, scoured our hangar, verified exactly what was there one day, and not to our surprise, I might add, we found that seats were missing and other evidence had been disturbed. The FBI, on my last complaint, did act, and they found that 3 o'clock on Saturday morning, 2 or 3 of their own agents were in our hangar. It was not authorized. I supervised that project, and these people had no connection to it. After that...
Do you know who those 2 agents would be?
No, sir, I do not.
Okay.
On another occasion in the main hangar, when I was working there, an agent from the FBI was brought in from Los Angeles. Apparently, from what I understood from other agents I talked to subsequent to my observation of this individual, he had arrived from the West Coast, had some experience in bomb investigation, and I saw him in the middle of the hangar with a hammer in the process of trying to flatten a piece of wreckage. In investigative work, you don't alter evidence. You take it in its original state and preserve it. But I actually saw this man with a hammer pounding on a piece of evidence trying to flatten it out.
What was the purpose of his doing that?
I have no idea, sir.
Was that agent Mr. Ricky Hahn?
I believe his name is Hahn. Another problem that I observed was that there were probably, I guess, the ratio in the hangar between safety board investigators and FBI and other folks was about 100 to 1. But I noticed during the course of documentation that the bomb technicians didn't seem to use the conventional method of documenting the evidence. You know, when you look at a piece of potential evidence, it should be photographed, measured, and then collected safely. On one occasion, I observed an agent walk up to a seat back, a tray table, if you can envision where they might be mounted on the back of the seat. And instead of looking at this piece of metal, it was a piece of plastic that was embedded in metal, and documenting it properly, the individual took out a pair of pliers, a Leatherman tool, and put tool marks on that piece of evidence and attempted to pull it out of the seat back to examine it. Totally unacceptable procedure.
Do you know the name of that individual?
No, sir, I don't. Another problem that occurred, and I think it was administrative, but it did affect the investigation, was the FBI's reluctance to commit its agents to participate on investigative groups. As you know, the safety board, when we send a GO team, has specialists. Each one of those specialists form an investigative group. Those groups are comprised of people from the FAA, from the airplane manufacturer, from the carrier, and any other agency that might help lend expertise to the investigation. They were certainly welcome to participate, but at no time were they offered to participate on groups. Conversely, for a period of about a month, 5 ATF agents worked on my group, and I have to say that they did contribute significantly to assisting in the reconstruction of the interior of the airplane. I think the other area of concern, and it's an administrative one, is the unkind, I guess is the best way I can put it, attitude that FBI management displayed toward the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms agents. I can understand because of some of the past history that there's maybe some friction, but I can remember several days where ATF agents were basically told to sit at picnic tables in the hangar and not allowed to actively participate in the investigation. Those were the exact times when we needed all the help we could get. Fortunately, I got 5 folks to help me in my hangar because I was in a separate facility. But I don't think it was an efficient use of manpower. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms is a very fine agency in terms of explosives investigation. And not to have that talent available, especially in my hangar with the reconstruction of the interior, did lead to some difficulty. I think the other 2 items are the release of personal items without consultation of the safety board. Had this been a criminal act, and there's no evidence to suggest that it is, I would think that every piece of material on that airplane, to include personal items, should have been documented and inventoried, and before any release was authorized, it should have been with the consensus of the NTSB and other parties to the investigation.
That's the end of your list.
Yes, sir, it is.
My staff was hoping you had one more thing on the list about the psychic.
Yes. That was already mentioned by Mr. Marks, my colleague, but I did not see the psychic. I arrived at the hangar about 10 minutes after the fact, and there was quite a bit of commotion. From what I understand, the visit to the hangar by the psychic was not authorized by any of the FBI supervisory personnel at the hangar. I have to say that for the most part, the FBI supervisors I worked with there were pretty reasonable people, but I can remember they were extremely distraught and concerned about the psychic. As a matter of fact, at our progress meeting that night, all of the folks that represented the parties to the investigation, and there were probably 80 in the room, in the interest of public, discussed it, and everybody expressed their concern, but it did happen.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Mr. Zaker, would you please give us your background, your expertise, and what role you played in the TWA investigation?
Yes. My name is Frank Zakar. I am a senior metallurgist at the National Transportation Safety Board. I've been working there for approximately 11 years now. My educational background basically is a Bachelor of Science in Metallurgical Engineering, which I earned in 1980, and a Master of Science in Metallurgy, which I earned in 1984. My expertise is in performing failure analysis of components involved in transportation-related accidents. My first 2 years with the Safety Board basically involved investigating airplane accidents where I would go out to the field and document wreckage and document any failures that might be related to structures failures, major structural failures. My major work is involved in the materials laboratory, and at times I am requested to go out to the field and perform examinations. Our laboratory basically examines 150 cases a year, and I approximately work on about 30 cases. Prior to coming to the Safety Board, I worked with, as a materials engineer for Lockheed Martin, and for a period of 4 years. My participation in the Flight 800 investigation was the first 3 months of the investigation. I reported to the investigation in the hangar approximately 3 days after the accident occurred, and the purpose was to examine for evidence of pre-existing structural failures in the airplane, looking for clues for corrosion, manufacturing defects, improper maintenance, and explosion damage. And secondly, to assist any of the investigators in the Safety Board with issues regarding materials used in manufacturing the airplane.
In a very general way, for my first question, I'd like to have you give us your recollections and thoughts on the way that the FBI recovered and handled the wreckage.
Well, first of all, I felt that there were some restrictions during the course of the investigation which impeded our ability to perform our examinations. The first policy was that, as Mr. Marks had indicated, restriction photography. The problem was that the FBI was concerned with safety and information that might leak from the hangar. So restrictions were imposed on photography. At that time, it was decided that in documenting evidence in the hangar, photographs were to be taken by FBI agents. We thought that was impractical, and we were able to work out an agreement that would allow us to take photographs, and in such case we were allowed to take photographs only when we were wearing red vests in the hangar. That would indicate to the FBI that basically there was a person with a camera on the scene, and it was part of the investigation. Of course, there was a double standard there in that the FBI photographer did not wear any red vests. Another issue that I would like to bring out was the developing a film. Again, this is relating to basically the first 2 weeks of the investigation. It was agreed upon that if we wanted to have film developed, they were to be taken to the command post within the hangar, the FBI command post, and that they would basically have the film processed for us, and the turnaround rate would be 1 day. I recall during my first submission, I submitted 1 roll of film, and that roll of film was not returned. I had a second submission of photographs, which I submitted 2 or 3 rolls of film that documented the wreckage. There was something very critical that I wanted to have on the second submission, and those were photographs that I took within the hangar of the entire layout of the operation. Our management had basically asked, they were interested in finding out how the operation had gone in the hangar. And I felt at that time that it was important to get an overall photograph of the entire layout. And because that film was given to the FBI and was not returned, I was not able to make a presentation to our headquarters office concerning the operation within the hangar.
It just disappeared?
Yes, basically, I delivered the film to an FBI agent at the command post within the hangar, and there were several of them, of course. That contributed to a problem. I gave my name, I gave the roll of film. He jotted down my name, put the roll of film next to that piece of paper, and I walked away assuming that the film would be processed and returned the following day.
Who's that person?
I don't recall the name of the agent. I had questioned whether or not that film had been developed. I had asked that question to a FBI photographer. He said he would look into it, and
To
the
this
prints
day, you
never
don't
showed
know.
up.
To this day, you don't know. Is that-
To this day, to the
Don't
best
know
of
if
my
it's ever
knowledge, the film
developed.
has not been recovered. I would like to add that when the film and prints were delivered, they were supposed to be delivered to a specific metal hanger within our command post. Our name would be on the envelope, and all we had to do was pick them up. I remember the first 3 weeks after the submission of these rolls of film, I checked every one of those envelopes in the metal file cabinet, and they were not to be found.
Did you read into this a message that we don't need you? Or from the FBI to you as an employee of the National NTSB, you know, that somehow your work was not respected, your work wasn't needed, we don't really need you around? Or don't you read a signal like that into that sort of activity?
Well, I feel that possibly there were too many people involved in the proceedings and the procedure, and that possibly the film was mishandled. And of course, that brings other suspicions as to why photographs of the entire operation could not be delivered to the NTSB. It raises concern.
Okay, I interrupted you, so please
Yes.
continue.
The other problems we had in the hangar was difficulties in exchanging of information. I found that there were many levels of management involved in handling information. There was the New York office of the FBI, the DC office. There were several agents running the FBI command post. That made it difficult for information to be transmitted to the proper offices. I found that to be quite different in our organization. At the NTSB, we have a list of investigators who are predetermined prior to being launched to the investigation. Each investigator has a specialty, and we feel that because this organization is predetermined prior to the launch, our goal is very specific, it's detailed, and there's no quarrel who's in charge to specific areas of the investigation. The other problem I encountered in the hangar was getting information in regards to how much of the wreckage was recovered. At times, inquiry would come up to our hangar regarding how much of the wreckage have you recovered. I found that, for example, the FBI had an evidence room which locked up personal items and other objects from the wreckage. I also found that at times we were interested in finding out what wreckage or what pieces of components from the airplane were being sent between the hangar and the FBI headquarters for laboratory examination. I found that to be a difficult subject. It took several days for us to find out what was being sent between the hangar and the headquarters in Washington, D.C. When inquiring about getting a list of items that were sent to the headquarters office, the response was basically, we can't give you a list, but will verbally give you the information that we have available, and you jot it down on a piece of paper. I thought that was a rather awkward way of conducting business. The other concern is altering of physical evidence. As Mr. Hank Hughes had indicated earlier, this is in regards to the examination of a passenger seat. I recall several agents working on a chair of a passenger and pulling out fragments from within the chair. There was some tearing involved and rather sloppy handling of the material that was removed from within that seat. I think it's important
to ask you at this point if you know who that individual or individuals may have been. Do you have the names of those people?
No, I don't recall.
Okay.
One of the interesting points that I'd like to make is that during the first several weeks of the operation, it was rather difficult to focus on one specific area. Wreckage was coming in by the truckload. And in encountering some of these problems, I was needed in the area where the unloading occurred so we could examine the wreckage. So it's rather difficult to keep focused on several of the problem areas within the hangar. But what I do want to stress is that we have expertise within the safety board which handles the area of seating, and one of them is Hank Hughes. And I think it would have been proper at that time, if anybody was going to handle any part of the wreckage, that they would notify the specific investigator at the NTSB what activities were being performed and to what extent. One of the problems we face is that after the wreckage is moved from one side of the hangar to the other, the evidence could be altered, and that could at the end cause a problem in interpretation of what will come out of the investigation. Another problem I had with observations at the hangar was a specific person, a special agent of the FBI, who rushed to judgment in looking at some evidence in the hangar. One of them was specifically, as I recall, this special agent was raising above his head a leg portion of a chair. And because he noted that the piece was severely damaged, he concluded that the damage was a result of bomb damage, without any scientific evidence. And this was in front of other investigators.
Did you see that yourself?
I saw that myself. I walked up to this gentleman and I asked him what basis did he have for this, and his answer was basically, if it's that badly damaged, what else could cause that damage?
That's what he said.
That's right.
Who was that individual?
I don't remember. And the interesting thing about it is I approached this gentleman and specifically told him, I think it's important to realize that it's important to keep an open mind and to also leave open the possibility that this damage could be caused by the airplane from a high altitude impacting the water. And sure enough, several weeks after I talked to this gentleman, the seats were laid out in the hangar in a position similar to what you would find inside the airplane. And it was concluded that the seats did have damage as a result of impact with the water. Another observation I made was that there was a specific attitude on the part of the FBI to continue the bomb and missile theory. There was a fixation on the bomb and missile case. I feel that this was not open-minded thinking, and that was not a professional manner to conduct an investigation. We at the Safety Board, when we examine wreckage, we keep an open mind, and we look for factual information which will develop the case, regardless of what the outcome is. We did not particularly care if the examination was going to be leading to a bomb theory or complete catastrophic failure of the airplane.
Was this approach really unreasonable in your point of view?
I think because of the overwhelming number of agents in the case and because of possible motivation that it was bomb damage, that the large mass of agents at the hangar overshadowed the fact that we had an accident investigation and that it was basically a domino effect from the very beginning. And the philosophy just continued on through the entire operation. And as I indicated earlier, it overshadowed the fact that the NTSB was conducting an accident investigation.
When you say it continues through the entire investigation, would you give me approximate dates from the start of the investigation until what time?
Well, I could only specify that I was in the hangar for the first 3 months, so during the first 3 months of the investigation,
very dominant.
it was very dominant from the very beginning. And one more item, and I'd like to say that the situation was, in the case of the FBI, was not whether someone was going to find evidence of a bomb, it's a matter of when. And there's a differentiate between whether and when. There was, I believe that possibly the FBI had knowledge of something that we were not aware of that possibly could have led them to believe it was missile damage, and that information was not shared with us early in the investigation.
But on hindsight, then you think that that was an unreasonable supposition on their part?
No, I think it's important. We all have a specific job. I feel that the FBI had a job to look for missile, any criminal wrongdoing, but to not keep an open mind and to not realize that there's another agency of the government performing an investigation is rather unprofessional.
I would ask you, Mr. Sekar, as well as Mr. Hughes, did you have any contact with a person by the name of Tom Thurman? And if so, what kind of contact?
Yes, sir, I did. Mr. Thurman at the time was the chief of the FBI explosives unit. I, in fact, arrived with some of his agents at the accident site. Early on, we worked for a period of several weeks. I won't say we worked with them because they wouldn't work with us, but we worked in close proximity with Mr. Thurman and his colleagues.
Were his actions consistent with the criticism that we've heard?
Yes, sir. As a matter of fact, I think in Mr. Thurman's case, I'm trying to pick my words carefully because I want to be accurate, but it was almost caustic. He showed no respect or no regard for our concerns in many cases. And a lot of our concerns and questions that we raised went ignored.
Mr. Sekar, would you answer the same question about knowing Mr. Thurman and what sort of contact you had with him? Or is
I have not met Mr. Thurman before or have worked with him before, so I can't go any further in describing his actions.
That's okay. Mr. Hughes, and maybe you can tell me a little more specific, how did Mr. Thurman's actions impede your work?
Well, Mr. Thurman represented what, from a practical standpoint, at least to the safety board investigators on scene, and basically there were two, Dr. Merritt Berkey and I, 1/3 of the, it's almost like there were three different FBIs. We had the FBI explosives unit, the FBI Manhattan office, and FBI headquarters. Mr. Thurman's group basically got to the scene, and when we started to assemble the parts and catalog them for later reconstruction, began to do their chemical screening and examination, looking for what they believed was an explosive device, bomb or missile. The problem was We have an organized, systematic approach to reconstructing aircraft, as well as trucks, buses, and trains. It's worked very well for many years. And when that conflicted with Mr. Thurman's operation, we clashed. We wanted to do it in a systematic, organized way. Their job, from what I could see, was more of a shotgun approach, trying to look at as much as possible in as short a time as they could. And it caused some problems and friction.
Thank you. Mr. Zakar, I think I'll go back to you on the next question. You've touched on here or there, but I just kind of want to bring it together all in one answer, and that is your impression of FBI leadership at the scene.
I'd like to add that I did not have specific problems with the individuals in the FBI. It was more of a philosophy and policy. I think that just to be open-minded, just to give an opinion, I would think that the operation would probably have been better if the agency kept an open mind that another agency was in the hangar and was involved in the TWA Flight 800 accident.
Yeah. My last question, did you know about or hear about the FBI bringing in a psychic, and what was your reaction?
I learned about the psychic during the hangar operation, but was nowhere near the psychic. My original impression is that basically it's an unscientific approach, and basically if it didn't interfere with my job, I basically did not have any feelings towards it. But I thought it was rather unscientific approach on the part of the FBI, and possibly a desperate attempt to further look at the possibility that the bomb did hit the airplane.
Final question to all of you, but maybe all of you don't want to answer it, but it's just a simple summation, whether or not any of you have anything you'd like to add in the interest of how to avoid problems like this in the future.
Yes, sir, I have some ideas.
Please go ahead.
The idea of professional respect, I think, is the first thing that needs to be considered. I know since the on-scene investigation has been completed, the safety board's initiated meetings with the FBI forensic folks, but I think the cultural attitude of turf fighting and that sort of thing's got to be done away with. We have one job, and that's an objective search for the truth. The only way we can do that is to respect each other and work in partnership. And I think from the top down in both organizations, if we adopt that philosophy, on an individual basis, we're going to get along fine. The FBI agents in the hangar that we worked with on a day-to-day basis were excellent people. They did the best they could. They worked their heart out. But I agree with what Mr. Zakar said. There's an institutional philosophy that is very troubling. It's not new to me. I spent 14 years in police work before I came to the safety board, so I'm familiar with it. But it's not constructive, and it needs to go.
Mr. Marks.
Well, the comments that just made by Hank I can second those. And basically, I think that there was just too many people that were involved from the FBI in this particular case that overshadowed anything else in the investigation. I think that there is a need to have a presence of the FBI and ATF or whatever, but not such an overbearing presence in the particular case. And of course, in the future, I think that it would be better to have the overall lead agency be the ones that know how to investigate the accident from the standpoint of a scientific and professional manner, that being the National Transportation Safety Board.
Mr. Zakar, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I feel that some of the difficulties within the investigation could be improved with increasing the speed of information that's traveled from one agency to another. And I feel that we may have to have a designated representative work closer to our organization early on, and somehow or another allow exchange of information in a much quicker manner without going through the different layers of management that we found within the investigation.
I know you've been here just with us in this official environment for a little over an hour, talking to the American people and to the Congress about the issue before this committee, this investigation and the mishandling of the TWA flight. But I think I want the American public to know that you have been working with the committee staff and other interested people over a long, long period of time. So I want to thank you very much for your testimony, for the benefit of your knowledge into these matters, and we greatly appreciate your cooperation, your contribution in educating us how we can avoid these problems in the future, because everything we talked about here is what can we do to make sure that when people step onto an airplane, they know that their government has been fully behind them in efforts to make for safe transportation. I know you know that's what your job's about, all forms of transportation for that matter for you. They expect that, and when we have these sort of bureaucratic and turf battles that you've talked about, it really doesn't give the American public the satisfaction that everybody in government is concerned about their safety. Now, I think you've shown that you have, but you ran into too many obstacles to do your work. We thank you for the work you do, and I'll dismiss you now. Thank you very much. You're welcome to stay if you want to stay through the entire hearing. Our next panel consists of Mr. Bill Tobin, former chief metallurgist of the FBI and one of the world's most renowned metallurgists. Mr. Tobin testified before this committee in September '97. He was still an FBI employee in the laboratory at that time. I would like to have Mr. Tobin give the committee his background, and I would like to ask the two people who are with you, our attorneys, and their purpose for accompanying Mr. Tobin, anything that they would like to say. Now, whether Mr. Tobin wants to speak first or the attorneys speak first, maybe it'd be better if we'd have the attorneys say why you're here. And then
Yes.
we'll go to Mr. Tobin for his background and expertise.
Yes. Good afternoon,
Please
Mr.
introduce
Chairman.
yourself.
Yes, my name is Charles A. DeMonico. I am an attorney in Pittsburgh with the law firm of Dickey, McKamey, and Chilcote. We, along with attorney Stephen Cohen, co-represent Mr. Tobin. Prior to joining the law firm of Dickey, McKamey, and Chilcote, I was with the U.S. Department of Justice for 15 years. I served as an assistant chief of the environmental crime section here in Washington, D.C. for about 9 years. And then prior to that, I was an assistant United States attorney in Pittsburgh for about 6 years. Prior to that, I was a prosecutor in the local district attorney's office for about 7 years. And so my background is primarily that involved in criminal prosecutions. While I was an assistant chief of the environmental crime section in Washington, D.C., I had the honor of serving the United States of America as lead counsel in the criminal prosecution relating to the Exxon Valdez oil spill. The National Transportation Safety Board played a very vital role in that investigation, and the result for the United States was tremendous, with a settlement in criminal and civil litigation in excess of $1 billion. I also had the honor of serving as senior counsel in a criminal prosecution of a major oil spill in San Juan, Puerto Rico. and that resulted in a jury conviction of 3 corporations as well as a criminal fine imposed of $75 million. William A. Tobin served as the chief metallurgist of the FBI, and he played an important role in determining the cause and the failure and provided expert testimony to the jury. He was extremely thorough in his analysis and clear in his testimony. He was professional at all times. And we are here providing counsel to Mr. Tobin because we understand that science is extremely important in disaster investigations. Without a proper scientific analysis that serves as a bedrock, investigative theories may be flawed and subsequent prosecutions, if any, may be problematic, and that coordination is the key to successful investigations and prosecutions. It's an honor for Attorney Stephen Cohn and for me to represent William Tobin in this proceeding. His only objective is to be cooperative and helpful to this subcommittee, and we would like to thank the chairman and the subcommittee for inviting William A. Tobin to provide testimony to the subcommittee in this important matter.
Mr. Cohn, do you have anything you want to say?
Yes, Senator. My name is Stephen Cohn. I'm an attorney with the firm of Cohn, and Colapinto, and also I'm the chairman of a nonprofit group, the National Whistleblower Center. In these capacities, I represent a number of current and former FBI agents. Unfortunately, the rules and regulations which govern FBI agent speech are at best unclear, at worst very restrictive. And part of my reason for being here is to provide counsel to Mr. Tobin. The FBI requires even its former agents to submit various testimony or public documents to the FBI, essentially to a censor for pre-publication clearance. It's our position that this requirement concerning communications with Congress is illegal and inappropriate. However, because there is some ambiguity in the law, we believe that Mr. Tobin does need representation here to ensure that his presentation complies with both the Constitution and the FBI regulations. Thank you.
Mr. Tobin, would you please stand? Would you raise your right hand? Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you, Mr. Tobin. Do you have any sort of a statement that you would like to make? I do want you to tell us about your background and your role with the TWA investigation, but any sort of statement you want to make beyond that is okay as well. And then I'll ask you questions.
No, Mr. Chairman, I don't.
Would you please give us your background then?
I have a Bachelor of Science degree in metallurgy from Case Institute of Technology in Cleveland. I continued my formal education in graduate school at Ohio State University, in George Washington University, and in the University of Virginia. I have studied and authored a number of publications in the forensic metallurgy arena, and I've been a guest speaker for all of the prominent professional societies throughout this country and in Canada.
Okay, would you, for my first question, what's your position, was your position at the FBI?
At that time, I was the civilian equivalent of the chief metallurgist for the FBI laboratory.
Okay. And then your role in the TWA 800 crash investigation?
My role was to evaluate whether there could be or was any criminal activity associated with any of the, as to the cause or the materials deformation or damage issues related to the crash.
When did you arrive at the hangar in Calverton, New York, where the plane was being reconstructed?
I arrived on August 4th of 1996.
At that time, did you have any inclination as to whether or not a bomb was the cause of the crash?
From what I had seen and heard in the media, it did have the earmarks potentially of having been a bomb.
Generally, what were the scientific issues you confronted in order to be able to reach any valid conclusions concerning the cause of the crash?
This air crash in particular is a very dynamic interaction of materials and forces that resulted in a massive amount of fractured and otherwise damaged metal aircraft components known to have been subjected to 3 of the most hostile circumstances that materials can undergo. In this particular case, it was a mid-air fuel explosion. There was impact of the pieces from approximately 2.5 miles in the air with the water's surface and subsequent undersea saltwater corrosion. The results were fractures, punctures, fragmentations, tears and rips, deformation, and thermal, mechanical, chemical, and electrochemical damage processes, including unavoidable recovery damage. This was an extraordinary combination of material interaction and degradation processes, each of which can serve to mask characteristics of the other processes. So in short, this was a massive and technically complex metallurgical undertaking.
Was your initial inclination that the cause of the crash was a bomb? Was it confirmed by your evaluations?
No, Mr. Chairman, they were not.
Why not?
The materials just completely lacked any of the characteristics that would support impulsively loaded materials from within the aircraft. The various characteristics that, and there are numerous, that would indicate the presence of a bomb resulting in impulsive loading were absent in the components.
What was it about the crash debris which disproved a bomb or missile theory?
Well, the bomb disproved the bomb theory because of the complete absence of any of the characteristics associated with the type of behavior that bombs can cause. As to the missile components, the same arguments would apply because that's also generally considered impulsive loading. But in addition, there were penetration problems. Admittedly, 100% of the aircraft was not recovered, but every time there was a portion of material missing, I could actually track through the multi-layered structures and actually find a component that existed in the path of what could have been viewed as an external penetration. Further, I would add that in some of those areas where there did appear to be a hole, the holes were from within outward rather than from outward in. That was another characteristic, but and that the material behavior was consistent with the fuel explosion known to have occurred.
Now I'd like to have you tell me what there is about your area of scientific expertise which qualified you to reach these conclusions that the cause of the crash was not a bomb.
Metallurgy or material science is the most appropriate scientific discipline to make the evaluations as to the material behavior and the deformation and damage associated with the various degradation and destructive processes.
Did you work with any other branches of the federal government during your years of disaster investigations?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I did.
How did you find working with the NTSB?
In my view, they are unsurpassed in their expertise, in their competence, and in their professionalism.
Within 30 days of arriving at Calverton, what was your professional assessment as to whether the cause of the crash was a bomb?
It progressed from an inclination of viewing the earmarks as possibly a bomb, but it changed rather quickly to a confirmation within my mind that there was no indication of a bomb and unlikely to be that of a missile within the first 30 days.
Did you discuss that assessment with members of the National Transportation Safety Board? If so, how did they respond?
I did. I have a very intimate relationship with them from having worked these disasters for approximately 25 years with them at that point. That, of course, would include derailments and maritime disasters, but we were in daily, and I would almost, I probably could safely say hourly contact in our very intimate working relationship. So there was not really any proactive discussion needed because we were in a constant information exchange mode while we were working together.
Did there come a time when explosive residues were found on crash pieces of the plane, and what was your reaction to this discovery?
Yes, there were 3 separate incidents or instances of the finding of high explosive residues on various parts. The first incident, I was quite skeptical, but when I re-examined the areas from which the residues were recovered, I confirmed that the surrounding materials showed no evidence whatsoever of any damage processes caused by a bomb. So at that point, I began to urge, partially because of my Marine Corps combat experience, urge that the history of this research, that this aircraft be researched, because when I was in combat, we all carried basically some C4, which is a high explosive, and it's very easy to transfer the residues. So I thought the possibility existed that this aircraft may have been used to ferry troops to the Middle East for the Middle East War, or that another possibility for the deposition was that the aircraft was used in drug sniffing exercises for canines.
When the second incident of explosive residues was found on a piece of the plane, what was your reaction?
I again repeated the process of confirmation as to the site and location from which the residues were recovered, and confirmed again no indication whatsoever of impulsive loading or bomb or missile damage. I strengthened and reiterated my suggestion that the history of this aircraft be researched.
How did Mr. Kallstrom inform you when the third incident, the high explosive RDX, was found on a piece of the recovered plane? What did he say?
When I was advised of that third finding of the residues, I was approached in a very excited manner, and the statement was, "We got it. We've got it. It's confirmed." And I asked what was confirmed, and he says, "We got it. Proof of the bomb." And I saw in the very agitated or hyper emotional state that he was in, that I needed to do some significant calming or try to bring it back down to earth, or to urge prudence and caution in interpretation of those RDX residues. I then decided that I probably should, I used the analogy of a cardboard box at that particular time, and what I was trying to convey to him was a simple materials analogy. My representation was, I said, "Jim, basically from a material science standpoint, this is what you've got. You've got a cardboard box. Your chemists are finding residues inside the cardboard box, and the sides of the box are not even bulged out. In my business, that's called a clue." That didn't sit well, and at that point he got about 6 inches from my face and proceeded to advise me in rather graphic terms that it was a bomb. And that's the most suitable presentation I can put on for prime time right now.
Was the insinuation when he's 6 inches away from your face is that he says it's a bomb, and you as a scientist had better say it's a bomb?
I don't know what he intended to insinuate or intended for me to, how he intended for me to use that. I do know that he was rather graphic in his approach that it was a bomb, and in fact I ended up wearing several particles of his saliva from that presentation. But
Did you tell Mr. Kallstrom that if there was to be a public pronouncement that Flight 800 crashed due to a bomb, that you would not support that announcement from the material science standpoint?
yes, Senator, that's correct.
Why did you say this to Mr. Kallstrom?
After the finding of the third explosive residue hit, and I saw the reaction and the fervor and the intensity and the frenzied reaction, and I also saw the clothes that he had that day, and I recognized the behavior immediately preceding most of the press conferences. And at that particular time, sorry, I have something in my eye here, but at that particular time, I saw that a major PR gaffe was imminent, was in the making. And I think in large part, due to my loyalty to the FBI, I decided at that point, thank you, that, as we would say in Vietnam, I needed to throw my body on the grenade at that particular time. Thank you. And I wanted to preclude or prevent a major PR gaffe that in my view was about to happen, from which I don't believe the FBI would have recovered for a very long time. And I then thought the last tool in my arsenal at that point was to indicate, to basically put the emperor without clothes, that if he was going to proceed to make an announcement that there was a bomb, that he would not be supported from the material science standpoint. So that was, at that point, the last tool in my arsenal.
Okay. My next point is kind of a summation maybe of what you said, but I want to ask it very direct. Based upon your direct personal observations, your direct contacts with Mr. Kallstrom and Mr. Maxwell, and your discussions with bomb tech and chemical analysts at the crash site, at the investigation site, had you not forcefully protested directly to Mr. Kallstrom, do you believe that the FBI would have publicly declared the cause of the TWA Flight 800 crash to have been caused by a bomb? And why do you think so, if you think so?
It is my opinion that that was imminent and would have occurred, but even if there was not 100% probability that it was going to occur, the odds were so high based on the actions and the demeanor and the tension, and that I, for the Bureau's sake, I decided it was not worth the chance. So that's when I interceded at that point and tried to put him in a position, exposing him, that to give him pause to think about any announcement that may be imminent.
Okay. I'm told on August the 13th, 96, you wrote in a memo to your supervisor, quote, "I am underwhelmed by the finding of RDX," end of quote. Why did you write this?
Several reasons. One is I, in fact, was underwhelmed by the finding of RDX, as I've already indicated. But it's partially my style to introduce some humor to try to get a point across. So I think I made up my own word in that particular time. But I decided after that announced after that proclamation from Mr. Kallstrom to me that it was an effing bomb, that I needed to start a documentation because I could foresee claims of malfeasance from the material science side, or just never communicated his findings, or there was no recording of my opinions, my positions. So at that point, I decided, and that was mid-August, I believe. I think it was August 13th, only several weeks after I arrived. And I also needed to try to start reversing the tide, to try to introduce back to headquarters the crack in the dam that to start trying to opening the focus of causes.
Did you have occasion to have to deal with an order for 1,000 random samples to be carved out of the aircraft?
Yes, I did.
What were your reasons for refusing to comply?
Throughout the whole interaction, except maybe the first week, I had some serious problems with statutory authority, Title 49 versus Title 18 issues. I, throughout the investigation, felt, and particularly in view of having worked so many of these with the NTSB in the past, that this was not our aircraft to be carving up. I also saw that would have, in effect, from the material science standpoint, a significant impeding effect on their carrying out their chartered mission under Title 49. I didn't feel that it was our place to be carving up their aircraft. Secondly, I had a problem. I and my colleague have spent almost our entire lives in metallurgy classrooms and in the practice of metallurgy and material science issues, and we were being told basically what samples we needed, how many samples we needed to draw our conclusions, and what tests would be conducted, albeit the test that was insisted that we by an individual who had not spent a minute in a metallurgy classroom. I would also add that the request was so absurd on its face, in part because we were ordered to put 1,000 random samples in a metallurgy machine. And to this day, we're not real sure what a metallurgy machine is, but that was the order at the time. Part of the, I'm sorry, may I amend my
Please do.
Part of the issues in that were that they were dissatisfied with the examinations we had conducted. They were dissatisfied with my lack of note-taking, and there were 5 reasons that I enunciated as to why I was not taking detailed notes on the examination of these fragments. From having worked the streets as an agent, why eyewitness testimony can be flawed, and I conveyed the speed of light. With the visual examinations, we were doing macroscopic examinations and stereo microscopic evaluations. But the supervisor in charge of the on-site investigation was dissatisfied with those examinations and was insisting that we put 1,000 random parts through a metallurgy machine. I would also add that those were the same techniques used by the financially interested parties, the parties who had billions of dollars at stake. They were not only using the same examination techniques that my colleague and I were using. In fact, they asked where I was able to, if they could purchase one of the items that I used for my examinations to help their examinations.
Did you ever hear the phrase bomb text 3, Tobin 0? And what did that mean if you heard it?
I wasn't aware you had that information. That was basically an analogy to a baseball game. The first week or so, I kept trying to urge prudence and caution in the interpretation of these explosive residue hits. When the third one came, I was basically told that in this baseball game that metallurgy had no runs and that the bomb techs had 3 runs, and how was there any credibility to be attached to my urgings of prudence and caution in the material science issues. I, at that point, tried to explain that NTSB and my joint materials data stream or data flow was a very long, complex, drawn-out process that we just couldn't walk up to an aircraft and take a swab and then get an instant hit. So, but in answer to your question, Senator, that was a baseball game analogy that was demonstrated to me.
At some point, did the bomb techs agree with yours and the NTSB's assessment that the cause of the crash was not a bomb?
Yes, Senator. I would estimate that probably 4 to 6 weeks, after about 4 to 6 weeks, we were all unanimously or near unanimously on the same page, and all being the bomb techs, the National Transportation Safety Board, and the metallurgy or the material science interest in the FBI laboratory. We were all unanimously, we were united in our observations and conclusions that there was no bomb or missile damage evident on those aircraft parts.
The term 4 to 6 weeks brings you to what date on the counter approximately? Just approximately.
My guess would be mid-September, early to mid-September.
Were you aware of the visit of a psychic at the investigation site?
Yes, I was.
What was your reaction to this visit?
I was very disturbed.
Well, tell me how disturbed you were.
That was at a very sensitive time in the investigation. Up to that point, there had been no release of scientific information to the American public. I felt, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I felt that that was a very wrong signal to be sending out to the American public, that 2 of the foremost agencies charged with as being guardians of the public safety had to resort to a psychic to resolve this aircraft, these aircraft issues, that their scientists were not sufficiently competent to deal with it. I also took it as a collective slap in our scientific and investigative faces in view of the mountain of experience that the NTSB and I had had working these things, that they felt the need to resort to a psychic at that particular time.
Go ahead.
I did understand and learn eventually that it was not an authorized a visit by the psychic, but then that brings the next question, raises the next question of
why?
If we were so, yes, Senator, if we were so controlling of another agency's personnel, why couldn't we control our own personnel?
Do you think someone was thinking in terms of getting brownie points by bringing in a psychic?
I can't address the motives for bringing a psychic in.
Okay.
I don't have any firsthand information.
Did you learn what the psychic's findings were?
I believe I did.
And do you want to say what those findings were?
I don't recall. They went in one ear and out the other,
Okay.
but that may have been the catalyst, and I didn't even put this together until recently. That may have been the catalyst for the pristine overhead bin incident that...
Well, let's talk about that.
I was ordered to, in a rather frenzied manner, to go conduct an exhaustive search in contact with my NTSB liaison, in liaison capacity, to find a certain overhead bin that was characterized as in pristine condition. But it was in a very emotional, very frenzied manner, so I inquired as to why I was looking for this particular pristine overhead bin on the port side of the aircraft that was from the left-hand side of the aircraft. And I was told that that was proof that NTSB was, quote, squirreling away evidence and stashing evidence, which again flies in the face of my interpretation of whose aircraft this was. But so I inquired as to why the pristine overhead bin was of such significance. I was told that that was demonstrative proof that they were squirreling away evidence, that the recovery had been captured on a videotape from the USS Grapple or the USS Grasp, whichever one of the recovery ships. And on the videotape, it showed this overhead bin being raised or set on the deck. And I said, well, I'm still missing some critical information. Why is this important? Why is this? That went off, yes. Well, that went off instantaneously, brought down a 747 with no recording on the FDR or CVR, or flight data recorder or the cockpit voice recorder, and didn't put a scratch in the overhead bin. And I was told, yes, we want that overhead bin. And I was told to go find that overhead bin.
Did you ever hear the expression that 260-some witnesses can't be wrong, referring to various eyewitness accounts which supported the bomb and missile theory?
Yes, I did.
Under what circumstances did you hear that position, and how did you respond to those comments?
That was the continual argument advanced when I continued to try to use the cardboard box analogy. That basically NTSB is in my position, and in a material scientist position, is that the box fragments, if you have a bomb in a box, the box fragments will tell the story. And my position was, I don't care how many witnesses say what, the container has to tell the story. And I was continually told that 260-some witnesses can't be wrong. Well, I repeatedly tried to convey the physics involved in the materials interactions. Number one, the velocity of sound and air, and why, from my experience as from having worked the streets as an agent, why eyewitness testimony can be flawed. And I conveyed the speed of light, the speed of sound and air, and the problems with audible and visual stimuli from witnesses that 260-some witnesses whose focus would have been brought to the same XYZ coordinates in space. That there were reasons why that those 260-some witnesses could not have, highly unlikely that they would have all seen the initial conflagration or explosion of that aircraft, a position which was ignored for a very long time, but which eventually was confirmed by CIA analysis.
What was the reaction of the FBI officials to your scientific position?
Well, the officials on site, when I first got there, I basically walked on water, but after about a week to 10 days, when it became clear that I was not supportive of the bomb or the missile proponents, I began to methodically get excluded from any input in the decision-making process with regard to bomb or missile or even mechanical failure causes.
Was your position ever validated, and if so, by whom and how?
My position with regard to the reasons why 260 witnesses could be wrong, yes. In fact, as I indicated, the CIA did a very excellent study and videotape showing the effects of audible and visual, thank you, visual stimulation and external stimuli, and that they in fact confirmed that those witnesses, it was highly unlikely that they would have seen the original event. And again, there were logical reasons why when one's attention is drawn over to an omnidirectional explosion, individuals will probably see fragments or something proceeding in a upward direction, trailing smoke and flames, particularly if it's from the fuel tank. So there were reasons why some of the characteristics that were described probably were seen.
Was there any scientific support justifying the missile theory cause of the crash?
No.
What were some of the characteristics which negated the missile theory?
Well, probably the most prominent, actually there were two main areas negating missile theory. One, of course, again, is the absence of impulsive loading or very high-speed fracture and failure mechanisms. But secondly, there were serious issues with every theory, or almost every theory, as to access of an external missile to the fuel tank. Even with, as I indicated earlier, if one would focus on an area where we didn't recover all of the fuel tank, there were components nearby that would have blocked or at least recorded passage of any externally penetrating object. And if that weren't the case, then there were many layers, including the external underbelly of the aircraft, and that was recovered almost, a huge portion of that was recovered. So that basically the only plausible theory for some of the missiles to have occurred would have been if there were missiles such that could maybe get through a 1 or 2 inch opening, make an immediate left, go 90 degrees through a seam, and then maybe take another 90-degree right, and then maybe reverse itself and come back over. But those were some of the considerations.
Yeah, like the single bullet theory. Despite these scientific explanations, did any FBI officials with responsibility over the crash scene continue to advance the missile theories?
Yes.
Did they continue to pursue these missile theories in a scientifically responsible manner? Please explain your answer, and particularly, I'd like to have you explain the pickle fork missile theory.
The answer to the first portion of that is no, they were not scientifically responsible. The pickle fork area or theory was a continued thorn in our sides. I tried to negate it and brunt it, but it reared its head in about the 3rd or 4th day. That was an area on the starboard side of the aircraft, the right side of the aircraft, that had what the appearance of some significant amount of material missing. Now, I would also add that what's important in the evaluations of the damage was the missile size that was the most prevalent and available to have penetrated the aircraft or was of the most reasonable threat was 3.5 to 4 inches in diameter. That's a critical dimension. This pickle fork area, I overheard the supervisor running the operation in briefings, again of dignitaries and other officials, indicating that there was material missing and about like this. Well, the hands, first of all, I noted were in a curved manner, which was not consistent with the damage, but secondly, it was also roughly 3.5 to 4 inches or 6 inches in diameter. So I saw that several times, and I thought I probably should step in and try to clarify this to nip this in the bud, because that was, I saw fueling, no pun intended, the perception and drawing out the theory that a missile caused the damage. So I went to the supervisor and I said, if you got a few minutes, let me describe to you the process by which a metallurgist or material science, or in this case, I conclude that there was only about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of material missing from this site. So I proceeded to take him through the logic processes. I actually used cardboard and cutouts and got him to agree that the fracture here was of this shape, and we cut the cardboard to the fracture size shape. Went to another portion of the hangar, and I got an agreement that these fractures in fact match. This is where it's from in the front portion of the fuel tank and the starboard side. and proceeded to then show, okay, now if we unfold this folded material, there's an additional 3 inches. I went through the whole process and got him to agree that there was only 1 to 1.5 inches of material missing. The very next day, I heard the same story to the next group of dignitaries, or he was briefing. So I thought, well, I'll try this again. So I went back that day or the next day and went through the same process again. And 2 days later, the same 3.5 to 4 inches of material was missing from this pickle fork area. And at that point, both the bomb techs and I threw up our hands. And
Can you give me the name of the individual involved?
that would be SSA Ken Maxwell.
Thank you. Did they continue to, no, I think you've answered that. Let me ask you if you have any recommendations as to how transportation disasters should be investigated by the forensic communities in the future.
I would have several recommendations in that regard. First, let me clarify, if you don't mind, just one sentence before I answer that. I would like to make clear that this was not a usual course of events for FBI NTSB interaction. The 25 years that I'd been working this, and my colleagues had been working this with the NTSB, was a beautiful system. It worked very, very well. This particular investigation was the aberration in my experience. So I would be reticent to suggest some coarse tuning, but rather some fine tuning. So the observations that I would offer, I would suggest be taken in a fine tuning mode. But my first observation is that the outcome or practice of science for such public safety issues of such magnitude should not be dependent on a single individual's agenda, biases, idiosyncrasies, or the strength of their personality, which it clearly was in this case. My second observation or suggestion is that scientists are not on an equal footing inside the law enforcement community with the strategic, in the strategic decision-making process. There are a number of examples of that, but basically scientists are, I won't say viewed as second-class citizens, but basically what happens inside the forensic community is if we corroborate or validate the prevailing theory, we walk on water. If the science does not validate the prevailing theory, then the science is just basically ignored. Those are, there are some other issues. I think the third would be that if there is some fine-tuning to be, additional fine-tuning, I would suggest that we revert back to the way that FBI and NTSB have worked these cases in the past, that the FBI's interests can be preserved by the presence of a material scientist who is experienced in materials deformation and damage, working alongside the NTSB, whether it's rail, maritime, or aircraft disasters, represent the FBI's interest in determining whether there is or could be potential criminal activity involved in the cause, and then allow that contingent to ratchet up whatever additional support or FBI involvement that there should be. So that would be my, basically, that the I think part of the problem that occurred here was that with the process and the system being so singularly dependent upon a single individual, a strong personality individual, that what I was seeing there in the first 4 to 6 weeks is what psychologists have found or concluded to be basically what was called groupthink, what they called groupthink. And I saw that very evident there where, and that was, if I may explain the term, was after the Bay of Pigs failure, psychologists determined one, if not the major cause of that disaster was that the decision-making process was comprised of individuals of very similar backgrounds, similar training, similar careers. In that strategic decision-making process, there was no dissenting opinion within that process. I saw that there was such a unanimity of opinion that it was a very, I felt like I was trying to stop a train single-handedly going 90 miles an hour there. And that's part of why I'm suggesting that if there's a way of fine-tuning or if fine-tuning is desired, that it should be somehow or other. And I think the resolution I'm offering is by allowing the material scientist and a very small contingent to liaison and represent the FBI's interest, I believe that could go a long way in reducing the vulnerability of groupthink, because NTSB clearly, in my personal experience, are the world-renowned experts in disaster investigations.
You know, what you just described here is some of the same problems that we found in Waco. The experts' advice is not given a voice. The negotiators and the HRT was in hard control at that particular time in that event. Let me ask you something along the same line, and that is that about advice and about how this went and what needs to be done for the future. We've had FBI officials claim that the TWA Flight 800 investigation was so good that it's a model for the future. Is it a model for the future?
I can only address the material science and the scientific issues, but I would say yes, it's a model, but it's a model how not to integrate proper science and how not to integrate the scientific conclusions into the strategic decision-making process. But clearly that's on the opposite end of the spectrum from the term that I believe the model was intended there.
Are the problems you encountered during the TWA 800 investigation characteristic of other disaster investigations that you've conducted for the FBI?
No, Senator. I will underscore that this was a singular aberration that was not characteristic of my prior working arrangement with NTSB or on behalf of the FBI. It was a beautiful synergy and relationship in every other situation that I represented the FBI's material interests in.
This is my last question. Your observations or recommendations you might have of what went wrong with the system with regard to the flow of scientific information.
A major flaw that I do see in the system is that it's too easily ignored by the strategic decision makers. I think if you look at the Unabomb situation, the Richard Jewell Centennial Park bombing, the TWA 800, the common thread is that the scientific flow of information is ignored when it doesn't support the prevailing theory. And again, that's the basis by which, part of the basis by which I suggest that scientists are not on an equal footing in the decision-making process within the law enforcement, or at least within the FBI.
You're a breath of fresh air, Mr. Tobin. You've been very helpful to us for not only appearing today, but for our getting the necessary background that needs to be done to make this a valuable contribution to the process of constitutional oversight by the Congress. I don't know how to thank you other than just to say thank you, and obviously you set an example for a person who was trained to seek the truth, to work for an organization that is always supposed to seek the truth and let the truth determine guilt or innocence. And I think you have lived up to that very well, and particularly you shine in this otherwise black hole of investigation that we had in regard to the TWA case. I thank you very much, and I'll dismiss you at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you all. At this point, I would like to ascertain if a Mr. Andrew Vita, our next witness, is in the audience. He is here? Okay, then we're going to proceed with Mr. Vita. Would you come? Oh, okay. Now, what am I going to? Now, does he have lawyers with him, or who's with him? Okay. As I said, Mr. Vita is our third panel. Andrew Vita is his entire name. He's Assistant Director of the ATF for Field Operations. Mr. Vita's testimony is of great value to the subcommittee. He has many years of experience as a federal law enforcement officer and as a senior manager within the ATF. He also has a reputation for high integrity. I thank you for that.
Thank you, Senator.
And he was directly involved in the issues surrounding the ATF CFI report. Mr. Vita also writes back to Washington, and this is why I owe him a particular thank you, because he did it at much inconvenience to him and his family. He had previously had a weekend planned over Mother's Day, and so obviously it is an inconvenience not only to him but his family. So we're very appreciative of your being here, Mr. Vita, and I have sworn other witnesses, so I'd like to have you rise and raise your right hand and say, do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. Are we going to give him? Yeah. As I have asked everybody else an opportunity to say whatever they want to, but at the very least, I would like to have you share your background, your expertise, and what your role was in the TWA investigation.
Senator, I've been with ATF for 29.5 years. I began my criminal investigative career in Chicago as a special agent and have moved up through the organization at various positions of increasing responsibility. During that tenure, I have also been the supervisor of one of our national response teams. I had that responsibility for 3.5 years while I was the ASAC in Philadelphia, during which time I had an opportunity to conduct a number of investigations of major explosive and fire scenes that have occurred around the country. In addition to that, since coming into headquarters, I have overseen the development of the majority of our criminal enforcement programs, both in the firearms and explosives area as well as our other areas of responsibility. And currently I oversee all of our field operations.
Do you have, before I ask questions, do you have anything you would like to open with?
No, sir, I do not have an opening statement.
Now, we have just delivered, am I right, the copy of the ATF report. Is this the report that was prepared by the ATF certified fire investigators in 1997?
Yes, Senator, it appears to be.
Could you explain the bottom line of the report?
I think, Senator, it probably can be best explained through one section of the synopsis, probably in better words than I could summarize, and then another section in the last page of the report. This document was prepared by our certified fire investigators, a team of investigators, along with our fire protection engineer, who reviewed the facts and circumstances and the evidence that was available on the date in which they prepared this report. It was to document our investigative findings and our kind of capturing in time what our opinion was as to what may have caused the downing of this aircraft. The report itself was developed over a period of time in collaboration with representatives from the NTSB and other investigators who worked on the TWA 800 flight investigation. The report itself is a documentation of their opinion based on theory and scientific evidence. It's critically important anytime we document our findings or our opinion that we not only provide what we believe to be an accurate representation of the element that caused this event to occur, but in our process we also try and make sure that we investigate as many of the other potential theories as possible so that we can't find that there's a conflict between theories. As important as it is for us to prove what we believe did happen, it's equally as important to make sure that we can show that other theories aren't equally as convincing or compelling. So we'll try not only to prove our position, but we'll also look to try and disprove other potential positions. This report was done by 3 very experienced investigators who had a great deal of past experience and had an opportunity to work at the scene in Long Island for a number of weeks, and it really documents their findings. What they say is that their investigation shows that the center fuel tank failed as a result of a fuel air explosion. The event occurred at an altitude of approximately 13,800 feet. The airspeed of TWA 800 at the time was approximately 400 miles per hour. This explosion caused structural failures of parts of the aircraft which compromised its airworthiness. At the time, Senator, you must realize that there was still investigation going on. There was a number of investigative pursuits that had to be explored, but what they were trying to do was document what they saw after evaluating the physical evidence recovered from that scene and in thoroughly examining the airplane itself, what remained from the airplane, to capture at that moment what they believed to have been the cause of that crash. It also leaves enough room so that there were a few parts that were missing, as in any puzzle. In this particular case, there were a couple of electronic components that were not recovered. There were some pumps and some probes and some other electronic elements of the system that controlled the fuel exchange within that aircraft that had not been recovered for a whole host of reasons. This report basically documented what we believe most probably did happen, but that we also had the opportunity that if those other components were recovered at a later date, or if additional evidence came to light that was not available at the time the report was written, that we would be able to explore the evidentiary value of those new findings to further revise and refine the final opinion of the reporters.
How convinced was ATF that the cause was a mechanical failure as opposed to sabotage?
At the time that the investigators wrote this report, they saw evidence of a mechanical failure. You bring up the point sabotage. I would think that if there was an effort to sabotage this aircraft, there's always the possibility that the saboteur would try and make whatever event caused the downing of this airplane to appear to be a mechanical or accidental nature. That would be a very realistic possibility. Because we say there was a mechanical failure, to then further explore the possibility that this mechanical failure may have been influenced by human intervention was another issue that had to be explored as well. And I know as the investigation continued, we're always looking for evidence of such behavior. I'm not aware that any was found in this particular case, but it's something that needs to be explored to its full extent.
How qualified were the experts who worked on this report?
The 3 CFIs that worked on this report, as well as other people that contributed to it, are probably as skilled criminal investigators in the fire science and explosive investigation as there is in federal government. I think these people are the renowned experts, at least within our organization. As we progressed through this investigation, I had an opportunity to travel to New York in late September of 1996, and I had a chance to watch the processing of the evidence that was there. I had a chance to go through the hangars that were being used for the reconstruction of various systems that comprised that aircraft. While I was there, I had a number of the investigators that were working from ATF, from the NTSB, from the FBI, and the other contributing agencies give me a series of briefings on the progress of that investigation. As I watched and listened and made my own personal observations, as well as processed the information that they were providing, it was very important for me personally to understand the theories that were being provided so that I could understand and that I would feel comfortable with conveying a final report on behalf of ATF as to the origin and cause of this matter. When I supervised the National Response Team, I tried in every investigation to remain neutral as our investigators, our scientists, and all of our other technicians reviewed the facts and circumstances of their investigation. And only at the end of that investigation did I allow each of them to kind of brief me and try and explain to me and convince me that this is in fact what actually did happen in this series of events. I did the same thing with this report. As the investigators proceeded with it, I had periodic briefings, and then when they kind of concluded with the investigation, at least as far as processing the evidence that was available, I had them come into Washington and provide a briefing for me and explain to me their theories. And I listened and I asked a lot of questions about some contrary opinions and some other views that may have conflicted with their theory. Throughout their examination and discussion, they were able to provide a very compelling argument for the theory that they provided. And I think even on one of the reports that I saw from them, I had written a note that it appears that the conditions are very ripe for the theory that you've described, but it's critically important that you're able to say exactly what caused the spark that may have been the initiator that caused this event to occur. At the time we discussed this, the key elements of that decision were not available. And those were some of the pumps and some of the probes that were a part of that system. Because they weren't available, we couldn't actually analyze those elements, which could be very important to the final decision. But the conditions certainly existed at that time in that center fuel tank of that aircraft that appeared that a mechanical cause was probably the cause of the downing of that airplane.
When the report was concluded, you attempted to deliver one copy to the NTSB and one copy to the FBI. I'm going to send, well, my general question is, but I'm going to send something up for you to look at. Would you tell us what happened subsequent to that? What we're delivering to you are these your handwritten contemporaneous notes that were made? And could you walk us through the sequence of events as reflected in this chart here?
Yes, Senator, this does appear to be my contemporaneous notes. As we concluded our portion of that investigation, we discussed how the information should best be conveyed to the appropriate authorities who were responsible for that investigation. Those deliberations include not only representatives from ATF, but also representatives from the department, so that we could properly and most professionally deliver our findings and our opinions at that time to the appropriate authorities. We briefed the Undersecretary's office, Undersecretary of Treasury's office, in February of 1997. At that time, I had the same team that briefed me in December come back with the answers to the questions that I had presented to them, as well as any more additional or conclusive findings that they may have developed, and provide a briefing to the Undersecretary's office. At the time, the Deputy or the Assistant Secretary for Enforcement was Mr. James Johnson, who was present during that briefing. I believe Undersecretary Kelly was unavailable on the date that we brought our people in. But we went over and discussed the issues and talked about our findings and the status of our review and report and how it should best be conveyed to the appropriate authorities. During the same time, I had an opportunity to talk both by phone and in person with Bill Esposito. Bill was, at the time, I'm not sure if he was the Assistant Director for their investigations or he had been promoted to the Deputy Director. But at some point during our very cordial relations, that promotion occurred. And I'm not sure where he was at the time we had our discussions. But during those discussions, I had mentioned to him what our people were doing on scene and what this report that we were going to put together was going to be. I explained to Bill that it was, again, as I mentioned, kind of a snapshot in time and documentation of what we had viewed and kind of what our opinions of as to the cause and origin of that explosion. I had asked Bill I had advised Bill that we would be very happy to provide a similar briefing for the director of the FBI, as well as Bill and other representatives of NTSB and the FBI at any time on our findings and our recommendations. We were working to convey and kind of put that session together, and I kind of left it in Bill's hands to set that up. Last discussion that he and I had had on that topic was that he was going to look into the availability of the people that would like to participate. Once our investigation, at least that point of the investigation, had concluded, we finally decided that it was important to convey that report as quickly as possible to the appropriate authorities. And at the time, the FBI out of the New York office was in charge of the investigation, as we understood. So we had asked that our special agent in charge in New York, who was Jack Ballas at the time, convey that report to the assistant director for the FBI, who was Jim Kallstrom. I believe that occurred on about right around March the 13th of 1997. In Jack's initial attempt to deliver the report, he met some resistance from the FBI as to accepting the report. And eventually I had to intervene and directed Jack to make sure that that report was delivered to the FBI. Prior to coming to ATF, I was a designer. And my background and training were such that as I reviewed the findings of our investigators that was documented in the report, that I had a understanding of the possibility that perhaps there could be a design flaw. If the opinions that were reflected in this report were accurate, that there could be a design concern within the construction of that aircraft that could be common to other airplanes made by that same company at or around the same time. I know in most products, as they go through an evolutionary design, they're improved periodically as the product is remanufactured. And I would be sure that as time went on, that design that may have been present in the airplane that was made when this plane was, may not have been consistent for a great amount of time after that airplane was kind of readdressed or maybe redesigned. So I wanted to make sure that if this design characteristic that was found in this airplane, if that was present in other planes of that same vintage, that the appropriate authorities would have an opportunity to examine those aircraft to ensure that the same occurrence that happened on July the 17th didn't reoccur in another aircraft of similar design. So it was very important to me, both from a criminal investigative perspective and from my past design background, that the appropriate information was delivered to the appropriate authorities so they could make those judgments, and if there was corrective action required, take that corrective action.
Do we want to go down? I'm going to, following up on what you just said and not disputing anything that you said, I want to, in regard to how these notes would have been received, ask in regard to Mr. Kallstrom, is it true that he wouldn't take them at first, later was kind of forced to take them?
Well, I had gotten most of my feedback from one of my deputies who was in discussions or in consultation with the SAC in New York, and he conveyed to me that the FBI was reluctant to accept the report that we had written. And it was my opinion that it was so important that that was unacceptable to me, and that's when I directed our special agent in charge to ensure that the FBI did get a copy of that report on the date that we were trying to convey that to them.
Okay. Then is it your understanding that Mr. Kallstrom called Assistant Secretary Kelly and ordered for the report not to be released?
Well, I can only interpret that from occurrences that came about after that first contact was made. I had received information from Director John McGaugh, the director of ATF, from conversations that I understood him to have had with Undersecretary Kelly about the delivery of the report. In my past conversations with Jack Ballas, it appears that after he delivered the report to Mr. Kallstrom, that Mr. Kallstrom may have contacted Undersecretary Kelly directly about that report, and I do not know exactly what was discussed in that conversation.
Do you have reason to believe that Mr. McGaugh conveyed public safety concerns to to Mr. Kelly, but Mr. Kelly disagreed.
Well, I know that the Director McGaugh, and I discussed this matter throughout this chain of events, and we both were very concerned about the safety of the flying public. And we wanted to make sure that the information was conveyed to the appropriate authorities. Senator, again, I make a distinction between the report and the information. It was most important for me that the information got to the appropriate authorities. If it was conveyed formally through that report, that would have been fine. But if it wasn't, as long as the information got to the appropriate authorities, that was the critical point for me.
So then the final analysis, the NTSB never did get the report officially, but it did get a bootleg copy of it, and information was shared with the National Transportation Safety Board.
Immediately upon finding that there was some difficulty in getting that report to the FBI, I made contact with the investigators that wrote the report, the 3 CFIs. I talked to one of the 3 CFIs and asked him how involved the NTSB was in developing the theory that they had documented in their report. They convinced me that the NTSB had collaborated in a lot of the investigative work that had been done and were very familiar with the information that was documented in their report. And as long as I was comfortable with the fact that the NTSB officials were familiar with the information, I was comfortable with the fact that that had been timely referred to that authority.
Yeah. Could I ask you to refer to your first notation, quote, as I read your handwriting, Kallstrom upset with report, locks him into eliminating missile. Would you explain that?
Yes, sir.
Your handwritten note.
Yes, sir. The notations to the left of the quote that you just referred to is a time, a phone number, and another name. The name there is Donnie, which would have been Donnie Carter, who is one of my deputy assistant directors, who would have been in direct contact with Jack Ballas. That was a note that I had kind of scribbled, scratched to myself after I had talked with Donnie, who advised me that from the conversation that he had with Mr. Ballas, that this was the impression that was given to him, that a reflection of Mr. Kallstrom's response to the report.
You think insinuated in that is that if that were true, if you eliminated the missile, then the FBI wouldn't have a case?
I don't know if I would say that, Senator, but I just documented what the response was, that Mr. Kallstrom had some concerns about the report.
Okay, now could I ask you to look at your second memo and explain that? And you also have that in front of you, but...
Yes, sir. That is a contemporaneous note that I wrote to myself as we went through this process. If I can, because of the glare, I'll refer to the copy that I have here before me.
Could you just read number 2 there in your handwriting?
Yes, sir.
And it goes also over to page 3.
Number 2 says that we have what we believe, whether right or wrong, evidence of possible design flaws in Boeing 727 airplanes. Now, 727 is a mistake, sir. It should be 747, but as I was writing here, I wrote the wrong number down.
Okay.
Which, again, we believe to be responsible for the downing of TWA Flight 800. This same configuration exists in possibly 100 similar planes in the United States, which could result, looks like I'm having trouble reading my own handwriting, Senator.
I think it is result.
Result in another similar air disaster. This is a Xerox copy, and it's a little bit tough to read.
Yeah.
And then going on to the next page, and we are being ordered not to release that information to the appropriate authorities for no compelling good reason to risk hundreds of human lives. That's what it says, sir.
Did your agency agree with this assessment?
When you say my agency, I can only express that I believe that this was kind of my documentation of my thoughts at the moment after discussions with Director McGaugh. I believe he shared a lot of the same feelings. My real concern was that the information, again, Senator, was given to the appropriate authorities. And at the time, Undersecretary Kelly was a member of the Presidential Commission on Aviation Safety and Security. And I was of the understanding that if the Undersecretary saw that there was some concern for the safety of the flying public, his role in that commission would certainly have been an excellent opportunity for him to share that with the appropriate authorities. So I was confident that that would be done. And in my discussions with our agents about the drafting of their report, I was also confident that the NTSB was aware of the information that we had developed.
What is the difference in the methodologies between the way that the FBI investigates an incident and the way the ATF does? For instance, ATF investigates accidents, but the FBI does not. And how did this difference affect the TWA investigation?
There are probably several differences in our methodology in approaching those type investigations. Any major event, where there's a major fire and explosion, we go to the scene and try and get to the heart of where and how the explosion occurred, whether if it was an explosion that may have caused a fire, or if it was a bomb of some type, or even an accidental explosion. We have authority under Title 18 to examine not only criminal locations or criminal acts, but also accidental explosions where there is a reasonable cause to believe that explosives could have been present. When we approach that investigation, we have no preconceptions whether it was the hand of a criminal act or if it was an accidental cause to that particular situation. We try and examine the scene from the heart out. We go to the heart of the scene and follow the scientific evidence that we recover and evaluate to lead us to follow-up investigation, whether it be interviews or additional scientific work that needs to be done. We try and focus our investigation at the scene of the crime or scene of the occurrence. Oftentimes I've seen the FBI's approach being indifferently in that they will try and take evidence from the scene to a separate location where they will reconstruct the situation as best they can. That's a little different approach than we take. We try and keep everything right there. But now, of course, when you deal with a mid-air crash such as this, or mid-air explosion, there was no way possible that anyone could examine the evidence recovered at the location it was found. It had to be taken up off the ocean floor and brought to some place where it could be examined. So that is a little bit of a difference there. But we try and focus our investigation on the heart and cause of the investigation in place, and then follow the evidence to wherever it leads us as far as processing that evidence in any interviews that we develop.
Okay, then how did this difference in methodologies you've just explained affect the TWA investigation?
As I mentioned, Senator, this is one of those rare circumstances that you could not examine the evidence where it was found. It's extremely difficult to first locate all the debris fields that would have resulted from that mid-air explosion, and then retrieve that evidence, bring it up, and then bring it and catalog it as far as location that it was found. As I remember, when I was in Long Island examining the evidence that had been recovered, the Navy, I believe, had used some side scan sonar equipment to help locate the various pieces of the aircraft that laid at the ocean floor, and did, I thought, an exceptional job. I thought that was a terrific use of technology to try and identify where pieces of that airplane ended up at the bottom of the ocean floor. Those debris fields often, in this case, did provide the investigators some very valuable information as to what may have broken away from the airplane first in the course that the airplane traveled. They found pieces of the nose in one place, they found pieces of wing and side panels of the fuselage at another place, and then they found the wings and the engine farther down course, which gave the impression certainly that the nose of the airplane was blown free of the aircraft in midair and fell as the rest of the plane proceeded down its course. There's some extremely valuable information gained from that. But the side scan sonar that the Navy provided was invaluable in trying to document the location of all those pieces of evidence.
Is it your view that the criminal nature of the FBI's methodology prolonged findings, the cause of the crash?
Senator, when you say prolonged, I know that as you conduct an investigation, there are numerous theories that evolve during that investigation. There will be theories that agents within your own agency feel very strongly about that you need to further examine and totally explore until you exhaust all the potential for those leads. Only when everyone is of the common understanding of the cause of that explosion can I feel comfortable with the final determination made by ATF. I have been on some very complex investigations where there have been a number of competing theories that evolved during the early stages of the investigation. So to say that they prolonged the investigation would be unfair without knowing all the information that they potentially had. I would expect that they had information of perhaps a national security concern that I would not be privy to, nor would I expect them to share directly with me. But I would expect and hope that if they did have that information, that they would thoroughly explore those leads till they were exhausted, so that we could be absolutely sure that the findings that we did come to were accurate and properly represented the federal government's investigation of that matter.
Would you compare for me the FBI and ATF's methodology in ruling out accidental and/or mechanical failure?
Well, I haven't had much experience in dealing with the FBI in investigating an accidental explosion. Our work has been, when we've worked with them in every case that I can recall, other than TWA 800, it was more from a criminal investigative nature. We go in there and try and be as objective as we possibly can, Senator, as we approach that, and again, not have a preconception as to what may have caused the fire or the explosion that we're looking at. We don't go to an explosive scene and say this is a bombing. We go to the explosive scene and say that there was an unexplained explosion here that we're going to have to determine how it happened. And that could have been a mechanical cause, that could have been an accidental cause, it could have been an act of God. There's all kinds of different events that may have occurred that triggered the explosion that ultimately caused the plane to crash. You look at lightning. Was there a possibility that lightning could have caused it? Even though we found what we believe to be the mechanical cause, we were never able to precisely explain the arc or the sparking that was the initial detonator to the explosion. That's something that is done through science and theory without any firsthand experience or eyewitness accounts.
You have advocated pre-incident protocols as a way to help future investigations. Could you explain what they are and why you feel they're so darn important?
Senator, interestingly enough, every time ATF responds to a major fire or explosive scene anywhere in the country, there are other agencies that also have jurisdictional concerns with those investigations. Invariably, you'll have several agencies responding to a scene and bringing with them tremendous amount of expertise, resources, ideas that would be of great value to the overall impact of that investigation. We have seen over time, especially in areas, perhaps I can use an example of our National Church Arson Task Force. When there's a fire at a church or a house of worship anywhere in the country, ATF, the FBI, and state and local authorities will most likely be responding to those situations. It's very important for the efficiency of operations and the public's trust in the confidence of law enforcement that when we do respond, we operate very efficiently in a collaborative way and take advantage of the value that each agency brings to that scene. For the last 2.5 years, I have been trying to work. I started to work with Bill Esposito and developing pre-response protocols that both ATF and the FBI could use when we respond to major incidents. Too often, there is a dispute over who has lead agency status when we arrive at the scene. And that lead agency status oftentimes dictates to which laboratory evidence that's recovered is going to go for processing. We need to have protocols in place so that when we do respond to those major incidents, that all responding agencies are working together, bringing the valuable assets and expertise that they have to that scene, and work together toward dealing with and identifying the source and the cause of that explosion or fire, whichever the case may be. It's important that we have these pre-incident protocols so that we do not have to rely on agency relationships in the field, personalities that may sometimes influence the way people work together. And it's really critically important that we have this plan in place for the efficiency and effectiveness of our operations.
Is the ATF explosive unit accredited?
Our laboratory is, sir, if that's the question,
Yes.
our laboratory is accredited, yes, sir.
When was that done?
I believe that we were accredited in 1984.
And is the FBI explosive units accredited?
I don't know, sir, not that I know of.
I'm done asking questions. Once again, I know you've gone way out of your way to be with us today, and we really appreciate it. You and the ATF have been very cooperative, and most importantly, you have expressed from the early days of the investigation your concern about public safety and to work with the National Transportation Safety Board and the airlines to get that information out. Everybody that travels by air owes you a great deal of gratitude for that, that approach. We thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you, Senator.
Now, how do you pronounce this? Yeah. Our final panel we have representatives of the FBI. We have Dr. Donald Kerr, Assistant Director of the FBI in charge of the Laboratory Division. And we have Mr. Louis Schiliro, Assistant Director in charge of the New York office. I've had the occasion to work with Dr. Kerr, and he has made many much-needed changes in the FBI lab, and not only for myself, but for the American people. We thank Dr. Kerr for that. Mr. Schiliro is Mr. Kallstrom's successor in the New York office, and we welcome both of you here. And before you get seated, if I could go through the process of asking you to raise your right hand and say, do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I will.
Thank you. Be seated, and we're going to, I assume, Dr. Kerr, in your position as Assistant Director, we should start with your testimony and then go to Mr. Schiliro's, then we'll have questions afterwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll assume that the rather long statement could be submitted for the record.
Let me make it clear for both of you. We're aware of the fact that you have a long statement. It will be included in the record as submitted, and the most recent revision will be included as well, and the same for Mr. Schiliro. And then if you could summarize in
well, that's good. We've saved a lot of your time, Mr. Chairman.
Normally in 5 minutes we ask you to summarize.
Right. What I'd like to do is just quickly hit a few points about the present status of the FBI laboratory, our plans for responding to major crime and the scenes of other incidents, and a few other points that I think are material to the interests you have today. First of all, with respect to accreditation, the FBI laboratory has been accredited in all 8 of the disciplines for which accreditation is offered by the American Society of Crime Lab Directors, and that took place last September. In areas where no accreditation is offered by ASCLD, such as digital evidence and certain areas of explosives investigation, we in fact are leading international efforts to try to come up with standards, guidance, and protocols that would support that. In the case of digital evidence, we chair the Interpol group as well as the standards working group in the United States. In the case of explosives, we're working with colleagues from ATF and, more importantly, with people from the United Kingdom, Ireland, Israel, Germany, and Australia. in order to build up a body of knowledge to which people could be tested and shown proficient. Lastly, with respect to the laboratory's current structure, we have in fact divided it into 3 branches, one of which deals with the traditional work with evidence and provides forensic examinations in all the disciplines. A second provides investigative technology support to our field offices and investigators. And the third includes, among other things, the response capabilities of the laboratory, which I will explain. Those latter are driven by our experience during the East Africa bombing investigations after the embassy explosions, informed as well by the TWA 800 involvement that we had and prior major bombings as well. The FBI now has 5 rapid deployment teams with people identified by name. They're teams of investigators, scientists, and engineers. Each is based on one of our field offices. For example, New York, with Mr. Schiliro, has one of them. 2 are based on our Washington field office, 1 on Miami, and 1 on Los Angeles. The laboratory division provides the scientific and technical component of that deployment team. They're, when on duty, expected to be able to move in a period of 4 to 8 hours. It includes a senior section chief from the laboratory division who then becomes the agent in charge scientific advisor on scene, backed up by laboratory division people here in our ops center, just as we did it during the African bombing case. There are roughly 20 people as part of the technical team. They're chosen from the disciplines that fit the incident. So in fact, if it's a bombing, it would be rather heavier in chemists and explosives examiners and trace examiners. On the other hand, if it was another kind of event, it would have a different makeup, including people, for example, from the DNA units. The other response capabilities that we include are drawn from our bomb data center, which not only trains the bomb techs for state and local police forces across the country, but also the FBI bomb techs. Our senior bomb techs within the bomb data center also have render safe authority for improvised explosive devices. They work closely with the hazardous materials unit, which deploys when weapons of mass destruction are suspected. They're the people who deal with the chemical and biological threats, the majority of which you're aware have been hoaxes in the last months. We have mobile laboratories that we can deploy, designed by the Army actually for treaty monitoring purposes, but it's a flyaway laboratory to support this kind of thing. The last part of our deployment capability is one that came into play during TWA 800 as well. You've spoken so far about the people from the forensic examination part of the division. We're also responsible for the FBI disaster squad, which is used for disaster victim identification, largely based on latent prints as a discipline, increasingly using mitochondrial DNA techniques as well. And so those people deployed in addition to the roughly 60 who deployed on TWA 800 from the laboratory division. The first examiners on site were from what's today the Materials and Devices Unit, which encompasses a lot of what used to be the explosives group. And at the same time, the disaster squad appeared to work in conjunction with the medical examiner to help with identifying the victims as the remains were brought back. 2 of the laboratory staff members received significant recognition for their participation. One was Bob Heckman, who was in fact the examiner in charge of the case for the laboratory division and had a lot to do with the day-to-day interaction with the New York field office. The other was Steve Burmeister. Dr. Burmeister is head of the chemistry unit, and they're the people who did the work examining the explosive residues and determining what they were. It was a difficult piece of work to do because those pieces of debris had been in the ocean, and so finding it at all was a major scientific feat. A number of other people were recognized at a somewhat lesser level for their performance, among them Mr. Tobin, who's just testified to you. We now plan for some of the coordination that you're concerned with, joint training with NTSB. And in fact, there's work ongoing for cross-training between the NTSB crash investigation courses and the courses that our evidence response teams get to be trained. We're responsible for training some 1,000 members of the evidence response teams in the field offices. It's a thing that started a few years ago. It's coming to a greater level of maturity today, but it's in fact the people who are most likely to be working the crime scene for the FBI before laboratory people arrive. And so the concern is that they be well versed in discovering, recovering, preserving, properly packaging evidence for shipment for examination. And lastly, a specific follow-up, again from TWA 800, is the work we're doing with the Department of Energy's Pacific Northwest Laboratory, together with the Naval Air Warfare Center, and in fact to do a specific set of field tests involving man-portable air defense systems fired at aerostructures to determine, in fact, what those aircraft structures look like after missile impact, and also to look at what forensic information might be available from the firing position. Because it turns out, for all the talk about these sorts of things in the past, that fundamental data is missing. And while metallurgists and others have some sense of what they might look for in the debris from the airplane, in fact, at the firing position, people have rarely, if ever, looked for specific information that would be probative in terms of an investigation. And even with respect to the damage to the aircraft itself, in most of the studies conducted by the Department of Defense, their concern ends when the airplane is hit, and not so much with looking at damage mechanisms that might have forensic value to us. So we're trying to remedy that lack of knowledge at this point in time. And that, Mr. Chairman, completes the update I wanted to give you, and we can go on.
Thank you, Dr. Kerr. Mr. Schiliro.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much for having me today. Just to explain briefly, at the time of the TWA disaster, I was the agent in charge in New York of the Criminal Division, and I was directed to report to Mauritius Coast Guard base some 2 hours after the flight went down. And I flew out over the flight scene about 2.5 hours after the plane went into the ocean. And I can tell you that everyone involved in that task that night believed at first that it would be a search and rescue mission, that in fact we would find survivors. And the response that we received from the Suffolk County Police Department, the Coast Guard, the New York City Police and Fire Department, and a lot of private craft was just absolutely phenomenal within the first few hours. I can also tell you that as the agent in charge at the Coast Guard station that night, that everyone involved was deeply and emotionally affected by what they saw. The hearts went out to the families of those victims, and I have no doubt that the experience is indelibly etched in their minds. And having personally witnessed it, I can tell you that it is something that I will never forget. I think as I heard the testimony today, I think that just 1 or 2 points I think that are important to bear in mind, and that is how we saw the events at the time, or at least in my 3 weeks that I spent out there. Certainly the way the aircraft went down, the fact that there was no warning, there was no radio traffic between the aircraft and the tower, the fact that it fell off the radar screen. I think the fact also that within a day the witness accounts that described seeing the craft go down in a ball of flames, and several saw flare-like devices heading upwards. At least from the investigators that were on scene that night, it became a very, very difficult issue to deal with. Particularly at the time of the tragedy, Ramzi Youssef was on trial in the United States District Court in the Southern District of New York, and he was charged in a conspiracy to blow up 12 U.S. airliners simultaneously over the Pacific Ocean. Youssef's plot, for which he was subsequently convicted, was not the stuff of science fiction. In fact, he had already tested the theory of concealing a small-shaped explosive charge on an aircraft, a test that resulted in the death of a Japanese citizen. And it is against this background, Mr. Chairman, the sudden disappearance of an aircraft with no distress call in an explosive fireball that we did, the FBI undertook a very massive and aggressive investigation. And we also had a fear, based on what the witnesses described to us, that if it were a human intervention, and particularly if it were a missile, that those responsible were still at large. And the geography of Suffolk County made that extremely difficult to contain. They were, if in fact existed, were under the flight path of one of the busiest airports in the world. And we know we needed to resolve that issue as quickly and expeditiously as possible. I have no doubt from the testimony I heard today that there weren't issues created, certainly initially and over the course of that investigation. But I can assure you, today I represent, I believe, some of the finest men and women in the FBI, and that is those of the New York office, and that we traveled some 9 miles out to sea and 150 feet below the ocean floor to recover over 1 million pieces of that aircraft in order to come to a sound, both scientific and investigative, resolution to that case. That office also traveled most recently to East Africa to resolve the embassy bombings there. We were involved with many of the agencies represented here today in the World Trade Center bombing. We have a very proud, I think, tradition in New York of working terrorism cases and certainly working in a multi-agency environment. But I welcome the questions that you have here today. I think it's an important issue, but I think certainly that there are many, many aspects of TWA 800 that we feel very proud to have been a part of.
Okay, well, I thank you very much for your testimony. Mr. Schiliro, in your new testimony that was submitted today, you attached an unsigned letter purportedly from Mr. Kallstrom that you referred to as a transmittal letter used to send the ATF report to the NTSB. Apparently no signed letter exists, and according to the NTSB, no letter was received. Also, if you read the letter, it seems to me the main purpose was to undermine and criticize the ATF report, not to transmit it as an official document. So any objective reading of the evidence tells me that no official transmittal took place, and certainly an unsigned letter is no proof of anything. As an agent who collects evidence, I would hope that you would agree. What proof do you have that an official transmittal of the report was made?
Mr. Chairman, if I could respectfully disagree, in our administrative files, the original letter is signed out as indicated by the block stamp on this file and a file number having been put in. The file copy, the one you have before you today, the one that was used for documentation is not signed. That is usually the case in how the FBI maintains their files. Having reviewed this, the transmittal letter, I would find it very unusual for the report not to have been transmitted to the NTSB on the date of March 17th, 1997. But the file copy, the file you received, would not have been signed.
Do you maintain a correspondence log?
The file copy that you see is our log. It's stated or it's stamped with the file number 265A.
Where's the signed letter then?
The signed letter would have been the transmittal letter, the one sent to NTSB. The copy letter, the file copy, would not have been signed.
Yeah, that was my next question. Do you, the NTSB does not have a record?
There's no doubt in my mind that this letter was sent, and the copy was forwarded to NTSB.
Oh, then let me ask you, why do you think the NTSB never received it?
I have no idea, Senator.
I don't know whether there's some heavy slashes and strokes through here. What's the meaning of?
That was indexed into our file system in order to allow us to retrieve the document.
Okay. Did Kallstrom tell you that he signed and sent the letter and report?
Not on this particular letter, but I have had conversations with Mr. Kallstrom about that report, and I do recall hearing him speak of his conversations with the NTSB about it.
Well, I would say that it's my opinion that a lack of valid copy lacks credibility. Of all the hundreds of documents that we have from Mr. Kallstrom, this is the only one that's not signed. That's a fact. This is the only one that's not signed, and we had boxes of documents delivered on Friday to us. Does the FBI confirm that a psychic was brought to the scene of the TWA 800, and if so, why?
It's my understanding that that did occur, yes, sir.
And
that was an inadvertent mistake on the part of the agent. He was out at Calverton at the time. The psychic called in and asked to be allowed to appear, and he allowed that to happen. But again, as previously testified to, that was unauthorized.
okay. Let me ask you, Mr. Kerr, is that your understanding as well, that a psychic was there?
That occurred prior to my joining the FBI in mid-October 1997, so I can't comment on it.
Let me ask you from the standpoint of your being an outstanding scientist, still am, but you were before you took over as well. What do you think of that, if that did happen?
Well, I sympathize with the position that Mr. Schiliro and Mr. Kallstrom were in. It was an unauthorized visit, and I suspect quite inappropriate at the time, and had they known of it, I expect it wouldn't have happened.
To both of you on another question, does the FBI acknowledge that the NTSB under Title 49 has the lead on investigating accidents until there's a determination of a criminal act? Would you start out, Mr. Schiliro?
I do agree with that, Senator, obviously. I think, though, that each case has to be looked at individually. Certainly the circumstances and the initial factual predicate that we usually undertake or attempt to undertake any investigation that we participate in. Certainly specifically at TWA, the circumstances surrounding the way the craft went down, the possible involvement of a terrorist act on any one of them. But I think you have to balance that on each occasion and a separate determination made.
How would you respond to the proposed legislation which would establish that all transportation accidents be investigated by the NTSB until evidence of criminal activity arose?
Well, I think the predication that you suggest is a valid one. However, I also think it's important to bear in mind that certainly in TWA and other cases, there is a great deal of information that comes into us outside of the actual crime scene or accident scene, as the case may be, to include both human intelligence, international information that we receive regarding terrorist threats, and certainly electronic information that we're receiving. And I think there's a great need to balance all those things so that we can come to a just and expeditious resolution. To the extent that the public is at danger as a result of human intervention, that also needs to be taken into account. And I think it was certainly in this case. But my experience, just to add a caveat, at Calverton and certainly at Moriches was a very positive one. The number of agencies that were involved, I think for the most part, the reaction, the bringing to bear of a great amount of expertise, both within the government and outside the government. And I think for the most part it worked pretty well. So I think that, basically the system did work as it should have worked.
Was there any disciplinary action imposed because of the unauthorized visit by the psychic?
To my knowledge, no, although I believe the agent was spoken to about it.
Dr. Kerr, when investigating a plane crash, does the FBI first rule out mechanical failures or design flaws in the aircraft?
In the part of the FBI that I'm associated with and responsible for, we don't rule in or rule out. Our job basically is to collect and examine whatever physical evidence there might be and to reach whatever conclusions that evidence might allow. The other thing we do is provide some of our technical people to support searches and other aspects of the investigation. They're typically not people who would be subsequently involved in examining the evidence.
Okay, Mr. Schiliro, same question for you.
Yes, basically, Senator, although I do think our focus is one of a criminal nature. I mean, our job is to determine whether or not there is evidence of a criminal act, to make that determination as fairly and as objectively as we can. And to the extent that the evidence rules that out, certainly there are other agencies in this government that have the responsibility to determine the cause of that crash.
In the case of your answer being yes, why wasn't it done then in the case of the TWA 800?
I think it was done, Senator. I think that the fact that over 1 million pieces of that craft needed to be recovered, the fact that it was 9 miles out and 120 feet below the ocean took some time to do. The fact of reconciling the manifest, the cargo manifest, the passenger manifest, the number of outside agencies we brought to bear to determine the best science that we could possibly bring to the resolution of that case. The fact that it took 16 months from the beginning till actually a final resolution was made, I don't find to be that extraordinary under these circumstances. And I think as soon as enough evidence was determined that there was no criminal cause, the FBI did remove itself, for the most part, from this investigation.
Yeah. I think that it's fair to say that today's witnesses disagree with you on that point. Let's start with Dr. Kerr. Why were basic evidentiary procedures so clearly violated in the following? The removal of a seat cover without regard to blast damage location, the mishandling of the victim's clothing in a refrigerated trunk, pulling fragments out of seat cushions without photographing and documenting alterations, and that's just 3 examples of a lot I could give, and I won't give any more, but you get the gist of the question.
No, I get the gist of the question. I'm afraid that I have to plead ignorance. I was not there. I was not in charge at the time.
Then I'll ask Mr. Schiliro.
Senator, certainly I don't dispute those renditions of what could have occurred in the handling of over 1 million pieces of evidence. There may have been some mistakes along the way. But I disagree to the extent that the number of pieces that we brought in, the fact that we had agents on each of the recovery craft that cataloged it. We did take GPS of the bodies recovered. The initial bodies, as you are aware, were not taken from beneath the sea. They were brought in from the surface, but the others were. I think it is a tribute to that effort that over every one of the victims were recovered. The number of items that we logged in exceeded 1 million. To the extent that there were errors made in several of those, I mean, I don't disagree with that, but we made every attempt to maintain a chain of custody. The issue on the photographs, I know that became an issue early on in the investigation, but the simple reason for that was that if any of those photographs became evidentiary in nature, that we needed to maintain the negatives. It was no more or less than that. And I think that for the most part, the investigators out there did get along and did maintain a dialogue on those issues. And as they came up, there were every attempt made to resolve them. So I kind of think that there's a sense that there was a great deal of animosity out there, and I didn't see that at all.
Dr. Kerr, even though you weren't there to answer, so you could not answer my question, I assume that there's an understanding that the procedure does not follow scientific protocol. So what would you be doing to make sure that it doesn't happen in the future then?
One reason we've invested so much effort both in training our own people in the laboratory division with regard to chain of custody and proper treatment of evidence, and are extending that as quickly and as completely as we can to the evidence response teams, is to avoid any question in the future about proper handling of evidence.
And Dr. Kerr, why isn't the FBI's explosive group accredited like the ATF lab is? What is it that the explosive group does that lends itself to not being accredited?
I don't think that ASCLD has accredited the ATF lab in the explosives group either. There are 8 disciplines that are accredited, and explosives is not one. A part of the explosives group that has to do with elemental analysis is in fact part of the accreditation, but there is no accreditation, for example, for the examiners who work on explosive components, for example.
Is the explosive group ever audited to make sure that it's following protocols and procedures?
Yes, it is.
Mr. Schiliro, why did Mr. Kallstrom initially refuse to accept the ATF report?
I don't know, Senator, if I described it as initially refused it. I think the problem was, as Mr. Tobin referred to, the cardboard box theory was before an opinion or a conclusion or a theory was finalized or written to report that the whole box be looked at. At the time that report was written, the investigation had not concluded yet. And I think he felt, from my discussions with him, that was premature in nature. The issue at that time certainly still could have been that had a criminal defendant been uncovered, that of course all the information that would go into that we wanted to be consistent with a final conclusion. And I think his feeling on this was, from my conversations with him, that it was premature, not that he was against the actual submission of it.
Dr. Kerr, could you share with us the results of the audit of the explosive group?
Well, we actually have a quality assurance unit in the laboratory in a separate reporting chain, and they roughly quarterly ascertain that the materials and devices unit is in fact adhering to our requirements to follow the ASCLD procedures for handling evidence, maintaining the chain of custody. We do proficiency tests of the examiners, and they're subject to the same moot court training that the examiners in the other disciplines in the laboratory are.
I guess I would maybe later on ask you to brief us on that.
Be happy to.
Procedures. Thank you. Let's see. Start with you, Dr. Kerr, and Mr. Schiliro on the same question. Why does the ATF methodology involve ruling out accidents prior to establishing a criminal act, while the FBI methodology is solely to prove a criminal act? Let me start with you, Mr. Schiliro.
I'm not so sure I agree that we go into it attempting to prove or disprove a criminal act as much as it is an attempt, as ATF does, to objectively go in and determine a cause. Our focus, admittedly, is the enforcement and investigation of Title 18. That's why we're there for. So I don't dispute the fact that we focus our efforts and our resources in a determination as to whether or not a criminal act occurred, and secondly, if an act did occur, whether or not a federal prosecution will emanate from that. I don't think, though, that's inconsistent with any of the agencies represented here today. And as a matter of fact, in the TWA case, there were two distinct groups formed. One was the mechanical failures group, and the other one was the law enforcement group. And I think that, you know, under the right circumstances, the investigative effort from each of those groups can be conducted in a consistent and objective manner. The fact that we have a criminal focus does not necessarily mean that we're not objective in our approach to that. But by our very nature and what we're charged with, the responsibility of, we do have a criminal focus. There's no dispute with that.
Dr. Kerr, anything to add?
I would only add that there were a number of theories advanced, both in the press by individuals who chose to come forward, and of course by those who were witnesses to the event. And within that highly speculative environment, one has to review the physical evidence and as much of it as possible in order to rule out a number of the theories that were in fact on the table. So I don't think it unusual at all, nor representative of a bias, to have the investigation go on for the period it did. And in fact, since I arrived as it was concluding, I did have the opportunity to talk to Jim Kallstrom. He was preparing to, in fact, go to the public with the results of the investigation in November. He was trying to assure himself, even in October and November of 1997, that all of the leads, all of the possibilities, and all of the expertise that he might have been able to call on had been consulted. And so we, in fact, brought in several outside people to assist in reviewing the reports before he went public.
Mr. Schiliro, in light of today's testimony, does the FBI still feel that the way that the TWA investigation was handled is a model for the future?
Well, Senator, having seen the beginnings of it, at least for the first month or two, I was amazed at the great expertise that the NTSB was able to bring to bear in terms of the accident investigation. Truly never having participated in an investigation of that nature before, it amazed me in terms of the expertise, the organizational skills, and how they went about organizing actually the reconstruction effort. It was just phenomenal in terms of this government, I think, at its finest. Certainly, I think we reacted from the terrorist task force. I mean, we did send, for the most part, the people that are associated with that group out to participate in that, and to certainly, if a criminal act had occurred, to investigate it and to resolve it. I think certainly with the amount of people involved and absolutely the horrendous nature of that tragedy, there were issues that were created. I think most of them were resolved on site. Some of them still linger, and others that you heard about here today. But I don't find that distressing. I think it's a constructive way to look at it. Obviously, if we had to do it again, there were certain things that we would go ahead and probably redo differently. But I think, bear in mind, we had never, at least in New York, reacted to a crime scene some distance out to sea and the distance that it was below the ocean floor. We needed to learn from that. We now have beginning a cross-training program with the NTSB, and hopefully the cultural differences will become less as that program proceeds. But I do believe that in many ways was a good effort. It brought together a lot of people of varying backgrounds. I think that was healthy in terms of a resolution to this. If there were differences, those differences were debated and I think brought to light. So I do think that, you know, from what I saw from the agents and the investigators involved out there, the sacrifice that they put forth, and I think still the emotional issues that remain today as a result of their dealings out there, I do believe that it was a good effort. Do I think there were mistakes that could be improved upon? Certainly I do.
Well, I hope you have an opportunity. I'm going to send you a list of the documents that were released today, and after you've studied them, see if you still got the same opinion. Dr. Kerr, have you begun negotiating a memorandum of understanding with the NTSB for future investigations?
People from the laboratory division were involved in the after-action report, and the specific thing that I mentioned to you about the cross-training between the NTSB program and our ERT program is something we'll work. The agency-to-agency MOU is not something that I'm responsible for.
It's my understanding that there has not actually begun that process of that memorandum of understanding, and I suppose if I want to know why, I'll have to ask somebody else other than you then. Is that?
That's correct.
Okay. Mr. Schiliro, your statement says the FBI, this is a quote, the FBI investigation of TWA Flights 800 was one of the most thorough and finest ever concluded by the agency, end of quote. I draw a very different conclusion based upon the testimony and evidence presented here, and I think that the public was ill-served by the FBI in the 800 investigation, and I intend to make sure that this type of investigation doesn't take place again. Dr. Kerr, are the rapid deployment teams the result of lessons learned from the problems discovered during the TWA case or any other case?
They're really an outgrowth of looking back at TWA 800, but more importantly, they were the result of discussions that Mr. Schiliro, Director Free, Assistant Director in charge of the Washington Field Office, Jimmy Carter, and I had on our way to East Africa as we thought through what we had already been doing to deploy our capabilities and what we ought to be planning to do in the future. And it was decided that we ought to formally identify these teams, train them, have their equipment ready for load out in a short time so that our response could basically be as fast as finding the transportation to get there. And so it was, yes, a learning and finding a way to improve our response.
The Inspector General, Dr. Kerr, last year raised the red flag that there were still cultural problems with the explosive groups. At a minimum, I think the groups should be heavily and constantly audited to know if they're doing their jobs right, and I'd like to know if you have that same concern.
Having watched them perform halfway around the world at 2 crime scenes, the equivalent of the Oklahoma City bombing, I am not concerned with their present level of performance. They're doing it very well.
So you disagree with the Inspector General then?
He made the statement before that happened, I believe.
Mr. Schiliro, if you knew that you needed to keep this is in regard to the films being made by the FBI instead of the National Transportation Board, if you needed to keep the negatives, where are those films now?
My understanding, Senator, is well over 400, and I could get back to you on this, but about 400 outside rolls of film were processed through our lab. My belief is we still have all those negatives.
Why did you need to keep the whole roll and not give Mr. Zukar his pictures?
I'm not familiar with Mr. Zukar's picture, but the reason to keep the negative is if any one of those pictures became evidentiary and we needed to introduce them in court, the U.S. Attorney who did come out and review the procedures in place would have had to have the original negative. That was just solely the reason to maintain chain of custody on that.
Well, I thank you all very much for answering our questions. You're the last panel, so the hearing is over now. I thank all of the witnesses, and particularly the FBI for cooperating with the subcommittee. I think the whole issue here is the efforts that agencies put forth to make sure that the traveling safety is there, the public safety is there, and also increasing confidence in federal law enforcement. The hearing's adjourned.